Around 50 CE in Hierapolis, a boy was born into slavery. His name is lost to history. The word Epictetus means simply acquired, like property. This child would never own land, never command armies, never write a single word. Yet his ideas would outlive emperors and reshape how humans understand freedom itself. The paradox runs deeper than you think. A man with no control over his body developed history's most sophisticated account of human agency. A slave created the philosophical foundation for what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy. Epictetus lived under Nero's secretary, studied philosophy with permission, earned freedom around age 33. Emperor Domitian later banished all philosophers from Rome in 93 CE. Epictetus moved to Nicopolis in Greece and established a school that attracted Rome's elite. He taught until roughly 135 CE. He never recorded his lectures. We know him only through notes his student Arrian compiled, creating 2 texts. The discourses capture classroom exchanges, 4 books of 8 surviving. The Enchiridion, or handbook, distills essentials into 53 brief chapters. These works influenced Marcus Aurelius, shaped early Christianity, vanished for centuries, then re-emerged to transform psychotherapy. Albert Ellis built rational emotive behavior therapy directly from Epictetus in the 1950s. What makes Epictetus essential now is not historical curiosity. His central insight cuts through every therapeutic system, every self-help industry claim, every promise of peace. He identified the precise mechanism by which humans create their own suffering. He mapped the cognitive architecture of freedom with surgical precision. And he did this without brain scans, without laboratories, through pure philosophical analysis of human experience. The questions he answered remain our questions. What parts of life lie within our power? How do we distinguish what we control from what we don't? Why do events themselves not determine our emotional responses? How can we train ourselves to maintain equanimity amid chaos? Modern neuroscience validates his framework while revealing its neural basis. Cognitive science maps his concepts onto prefrontal cortex function. Clinical psychology proves his methods work across cultures and disorders. This is not ancient wisdom repackaged. This is rigorous philosophy that anticipated modern psychology by 2,000 years. Every claim Epictetus makes rests on verifiable reasoning. Every technique he prescribes targets specific cognitive mechanisms. Understanding him requires understanding both his arguments and their empirical validation. Part 1. The Architecture of Volition. Epictetus centers everything on one Greek word that appears 168 times in surviving texts: prohairesis. No English translation captures it completely. Scholars render it variously as volition, moral character, will, choice, rational decision, or moral purpose. Each translation illuminates one facet while obscuring others. The word's etymology reveals its structure. Pro means before or in favour of. Hairesis means taking, grasping, or selecting. Combined, prohairesis signifies choosing that happens before action, the capacity to evaluate and select among possibilities. But Epictetus expands this common Greek term into something unprecedented in ancient philosophy. He makes it the fundamental human faculty that separates us from animals and defines our moral nature. Prohairesis operates at the intersection of cognition and action. It contains 2 primary functions that work as one integrated capacity. First, assent, the ability to accept or reject impressions that arise in consciousness. Second, impulse, the ability to move toward or away from objects of desire and aversion. These aren't separate processes, but unified moments of rational choice. Think about what happens when someone insults you. The insult arrives as sensory data, words travelling as sound waves. Your auditory system processes these into neural patterns representing semantic content. This creates what Epictetus calls an impression, a fantasia, a representation that appears in your awareness. The impression itself is not up to you. It simply happens, caused by external events impinging on your sense organs. But what occurs next divides human from animal. You can pause before reacting. You can examine the impression and ask whether you should accept its evaluative content. The words reached your ears, true, but must you accept the judgment that you have been genuinely harmed? Must you assent to the belief that your worth depends on others' opinions? This moment of evaluation, this capacity to withhold or grant assent, is proheresis in action. Epictetus distinguishes sharply between impression formation and assent to impressions. Your nervous system generates impressions automatically, constantly, outside voluntary control. A loud noise creates a startle impression. An attractive face generates an impression of beauty. These are passive processes, determined by your sensory apparatus and neural wiring. But proheresis governs how you respond to what appears. It can examine impressions, test them against reason, accept or reject their implicit claims. This maps directly onto modern neuroscience, though Epictetus obviously lacked that vocabulary. The automatic generation of impressions corresponds to bottom-up sensory processing and subcortical emotional responses. The amygdala detects potential threats and generates fear responses within milliseconds before conscious awareness. The ventral striatum responds to reward cues, creating attraction and craving. These processes are ancient, evolutionarily conserved, and operate without conscious deliberation. Proheresis corresponds to prefrontal cortex function, specifically cognitive control mechanisms. The lateral prefrontal cortex enables us to maintain goals in working memory and use them to evaluate incoming information. The dorsal anterior cingulate cortex detects conflicts between automatic responses and our intentions. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex integrates value information and guides decision-making. Together, these regions create what neuroscientists call executive function, the ability to override automatic responses in service of chosen goals. Research on response inhibition demonstrates this beautifully. In stop-signal tasks, subjects must inhibit a prepared motor response when they receive a stop cue. Success requires detecting the cue, which activates the pre-supplementary motor area. This region signals the need for inhibition to the right inferior frontal gyrus. The inferior frontal gyrus then implements stopping by modulating subcortical motor pathways. Individual differences in stopping ability correlate with connectivity between these prefrontal regions. The locus coeruleus, a tiny brainstem structure containing norepinephrine neurons, plays a crucial regulatory role. These neurons project to prefrontal cortex and modulate its function. Stimulating locus coeruleus inputs to dorsomedial prefrontal cortex improves attentional focus. Stimulating inputs to ventrolateral orbitofrontal cortex reduces impulsive responses. Better locus coeruleus integrity in older adults correlates with stronger prefrontal connectivity and better inhibitory control. This neural architecture provides the biological basis for what Epictetus describes as proheresis. We possess circuitry that can intervene between stimulus and response, between impression and action. This circuitry requires noradrenergic arousal to function optimally. It degrades with age, brain injury, and certain disorders. But when healthy, it gives us genuine choice over our reactions. Epictetus makes an even stronger claim that modern neuroscience partially validates. He argues that proheresis is by nature unimpeded, that nothing external can constrain it. You can chain his leg, but even Zeus cannot overcome his decision. This sounds like hyperbole until you grasp what he means. He distinguishes sharply between the capacity for choice and its outcomes. External forces can prevent you from achieving what you choose. A prison cell constrains your movement. Illness limits your physical capacities. Other people's choices affect what opportunities you have. But nothing external can force you to assent to false judgments or desire impossible things. The actual moment of choice, the act of judging an impression true or false, good or bad, occurs entirely within your prohairesis. Modern cognitive neuroscience confirms that evaluation and judgment are internal processes. No external stimulus directly determines what you believe or value. Stimuli can influence these processes by creating impressions and biasing attention. Marketing exploits these influences constantly. Social pressure shapes judgments through conformity mechanisms, but influence differs fundamentally from determination. The final act of believing or valuing still requires your assent, however automatic it may feel. This is why Epictetus can claim absolute freedom even in slavery. His master controlled his body, his location, his labour, but his master could not force him to believe slavery was good or that his master was admirable. External compulsion reaches its limit at the threshold of judgment. You can torture someone into saying they believe something. You cannot torture them into actually believing it. Belief requires assent, and assent remains internal to prohairesis. The clinical implications are profound. Most psychological suffering results from assenting to false judgments about what matters and where value resides. Depression involves believing that your worth depends on achievements or others' approval. Anxiety involves believing that unlikely future events deserve present distress. Anger involves believing that others' choices directly harm your well-being. These beliefs are not simply thoughts that occur to you. They are judgments you have assented to, often unconsciously and habitually. The depressed person hasn't merely noticed thoughts about worthlessness. They have assented to the claim that these thoughts are true. They treat the impression of worthlessness as an accurate representation of reality. Cognitive behavioral therapy directly targets this assent process. CBT teaches clients to notice automatic thoughts, which are impressions in Epictetus's framework. It then trains them to evaluate these thoughts rather than automatically accepting them. Is this thought based on evidence or assumption? Does it follow logically from the facts? Would I apply this standard to someone else? These questions create space between impression and assent, allowing prohairesis to function. Albert Ellis explicitly credited Epictetus as the philosophical foundation for rational emotive behavior therapy. He built his approach directly on the principle that people disturb themselves not by events, but by their beliefs about events. Aaron Beck, founder of cognitive therapy, similarly emphasized evaluating and modifying dysfunctional beliefs. Both recognized that Epictetus had identified the core mechanism 2 millennia earlier. The connection runs deeper than historical influence. Stoic philosophy was genuine philosophical therapy, practiced in communities that functioned like clinical settings. Epictetus's school at Nicopolis operated as what he called a hospital for sick souls. Students arrived disturbed by passions, enslaved to false judgments about externals. Through philosophical training, they learned to restore their prohairesis to its natural condition. This training involved 3 interconnected areas that Epictetus called topics, or fields of study. First, the topic of desire and aversion, learning what to pursue and avoid. Second, the topic of impulse and appropriate action, choosing correct behavior in your roles. Third, the topic of assent, developing epistemic security and avoiding error. Each topic strengthens different aspects of prohairesis, creating comprehensive cognitive restructuring. Modern mindfulness-based interventions add another dimension to understanding prohairesis. Mindfulness trains the capacity to observe mental events without immediately reacting to them. This creates what psychologists call metacognitive awareness, awareness of awareness itself. You notice that you are having a thought, rather than being lost in the thought. Epictetus described exactly this capacity when he instructed students to apostrophize disturbing impressions. When anxiety arises, address it directly, saying you are just an impression and not at all the thing you claim to be. This externalization creates psychological distance between you and the impression. The impression becomes an object you observe rather than a transparent lens through which you see reality. Neuroscience identifies this distancing as recruiting dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to regulate limbic responses. When subjects reappraise emotional stimuli, treating them as mere images rather than immediate threats, prefrontal activation increases while amygdala activation decreases. The subjective experience of distance from emotions corresponds to measurable changes in brain connectivity. Proheresis operates by recruiting cognitive control networks to modulate automatic emotional responses. But proheresis is not simply cognition. Epictetus insists it defines your identity, your character, who you are. Your proheresis in its current state constitutes your moral self. A person with well-ordered proheresis is virtuous, happy, free. A person with disordered proheresis is vicious, miserable, enslaved. This claim initially seems strange to modern ears. We distinguish sharply between cognition and character, between how you think and who you are. But Epictetus dissolves this distinction through careful analysis. Your character is not some essence separate from your choices. It is the relatively stable pattern of how you choose, what you value, what you pursue and avoid. Someone with courage isn't someone possessing some mysterious courage property. They are someone who reliably chooses courageously when courage is appropriate. Their proheresis has been trained through habituation to make certain judgments automatically. This connects to Aristotle's earlier concept of hexis, a trained disposition or state of character. Aristotle argued that virtues are acquired through practice, through repeatedly choosing virtuously until it becomes second nature. Epictetus agrees, but locates this training specifically in proheresis. You become courageous by repeatedly choosing to assent to impressions in courageous ways and to resist impressions that would move you toward cowardice. The reflexivity of proheresis matters crucially here. Proheresis can take itself as its object. You can choose how to shape your future choosing. You can deliberately train your habits of attention, evaluation, and response. This is what Epictetus means by keeping your proheresis in accordance with nature. You use your capacity for rational choice to align itself with rational principles, creating positive feedback that strengthens virtue. Part 2. The Dichotomy of Control. The opening sentence of the Enchiridion contains the most quoted, most misunderstood claim in Stoic philosophy. Some things are up to us, other things are not up to us. Modern interpreters call this the dichotomy of control, a phrase Epictetus never used, but which captures his fundamental distinction. What lies within our power? Epictetus lists 4 categories in the handbook's first paragraph: opinion, impulse, desire, and aversion. Everything which is our own doing. What lies outside our power? Body, property, reputation, office. Everything which is not our own doing. This appears simple until you examine actual cases. Consider raising your arm. The action seems completely under your control, your own doing, but a bully could hold your arm down, preventing the movement. Physical constraints can thwart your intentions. Paralysis, restraints, or simple mechanical obstacles can stop bodily movements you will to perform. So, is arm movement in your control or not? Epictetus would say the impulse to raise your arm belongs to you, absolutely. The actual movement of your arm through space is not fully yours because external factors can prevent it. Your proheresis controls the choice to attempt the movement. Physics, biology, and other people's actions determine whether the movement occurs. This reveals a more sophisticated distinction than initial appearances suggest. The dichotomy doesn't divide actions from non-actions or mental from physical. It divides the internal operations of prohairesis from everything external to it, including bodily outcomes of choices. What prohairesis controls completely is its own activity, the movements of thought itself. You can choose what to believe about evidence presented to you. You can choose what to value among the options you perceive. You can choose what to pursue and what to avoid in your intentions. External circumstances might eliminate certain options from your choice set. A prisoner cannot choose to walk freely outside, but the prisoner can choose how to evaluate imprisonment and what to value within constraints. Critics immediately identify the problem here. How do we determine which mental operations truly lie within our control? Modern psychology and neuroscience reveal that unconscious processes generate much of what we experience as choice. Priming studies show that exposure to words or images influences subsequent decisions without conscious awareness. Split brain research demonstrates that the left hemisphere confabulates explanations for actions initiated by the right hemisphere. Addiction makes this viscerally clear. An addict knows their substance use is destructive, believes they should stop, genuinely wants to quit. Yet they repeatedly choose to use again, despite these beliefs and desires. Is the choice to use within their control? If prohairesis controls desire and impulse, why can't they simply choose differently? Epictetus would respond that addiction represents disordered prohairesis, not proof that prohairesis lacks control. The addict has repeatedly assented to false judgments about where good resides. They have trained their prohairesis to treat the substance as genuinely valuable, as something they need for happiness. This training created neural pathways that now activate automatically when substance cues appear. The automatic activation doesn't eliminate control, but it makes exercising control vastly more difficult. Recovery requires retraining prohairesis, creating new habits of evaluation and response through repeated practice. Modern addiction treatment confirms this. Cognitive behavioral therapy for addiction teaches clients to identify triggers, which are impressions in Epictetus's framework. It trains them to evaluate cravings as temporary neural events rather than commands they must obey. Neuroscience provides the mechanism. Addiction hijacks the ventral striatum's reward prediction circuitry, creating powerful dopamine responses to drug cues. These responses generate intense impulses that feel irresistible. But the prefrontal cortex retains the capacity to regulate these impulses through cognitive control mechanisms. Strengthening prefrontal connectivity through practice, mindfulness, or pharmacological support can restore regulatory capacity. The dichotomy of control doesn't claim that exercising control is easy, or that all people have equal capacity. It claims that the locus of control resides in prohairesis, not in external circumstances. A person with damaged prefrontal cortex has compromised prohairesis, reduced capacity for rational choice. A person raised in trauma has trained prohairesis badly, developed harmful habits of judgment. But in both cases, the target for intervention remains the same, restoring or retraining the faculty of rational choice. The dichotomy has profound implications for how we understand responsibility and blame. Epictetus argues that other people's choices are external to you, completely outside your control. Someone insults you, betrays you, harms you physically. Their choice to act this way belongs entirely to their prohairesis, not yours. You cannot control their choice, cannot compel them to choose differently. Therefore, Epictetus concludes, you should not base your happiness on how others choose. If your peace depends on others treating you well, you have placed your well-being in their power. You have enslaved yourself to external circumstances you cannot control. This sounds like victim blaming until you grasp the full argument. Epictetus isn't saying that others' harmful actions don't matter morally or don't deserve response. He's making a narrower psychological claim about where suffering originates. The harmful action is one thing, external and not under your control. Your judgment that this action has destroyed your happiness is something else entirely, internal and fully under your control. Consider a practical example. Your colleague takes credit for your work in front of your boss. This is unjust, genuinely wrong, harmful to your career prospects. You have every right to correct the record and address the injustice. But Epictetus asks whether you need to torture yourself with rage, resentment, and thoughts of revenge. Does your inner peace require your colleague to acknowledge their wrong? Have you given them power over your emotional state? The dichotomy suggests a different approach. Recognize that your colleague's choice belongs to them and reflects their character, not yours. Your reputation with your boss is partly external, something you influence but don't fully control. Whether you maintain your integrity and respond justly is entirely within your power. Focus your energy where you have control. Accept what lies outside your control without emotional resistance. Modern research on locus of control validates this framework empirically. People with internal locus of control believe their actions significantly influence outcomes. People with external locus of control believe outcomes depend primarily on luck, fate, or others' actions. Internal locus of control correlates with better mental health, higher achievement, and greater life satisfaction across cultures. External locus of control correlates with depression, anxiety, learned helplessness, and poor coping strategies. The causal mechanism appears bidirectional. Believing you can control outcomes motivates effort, which produces better outcomes, which reinforces the belief. Believing you lack control undermines effort, producing worse outcomes, which confirms the belief. But crude internal locus of control backfires when it denies genuine external constraints. Telling someone living in poverty that their situation is entirely under their control is both factually wrong and psychologically harmful. Many outcomes depend heavily on circumstances like family wealth, educational opportunities, discrimination, and systemic inequalities. Epictetus's dichotomy is more sophisticated than simple internal locus of control. It doesn't claim you control all outcomes. It claims you control your choices within whatever constraints you face, and that this limited control is sufficient for happiness. A person in poverty faces massive external obstacles to material success. Epictetus would never deny this, but he would insist that poverty itself is not evil, not genuinely harmful to what matters most. Your moral character, your integrity, your rational capacity remain fully available regardless of wealth. You can still choose to be generous with what little you have. You can still treat others with justice and kindness. You can still develop your mind through thought and learning. This sounds like rationalization to critics, a philosophical sleight of hand that denies real suffering. But consider the alternative framework. If you believe happiness requires wealth, you make your well-being dependent on factors largely outside your control in many societies. You set yourself up for perpetual dissatisfaction because there will always be someone wealthier, always be obstacles to obtaining more. You surrender your agency to external circumstances. The Stoic claim is not that poverty doesn't matter at all. It's that poverty is a preferred indifferent, something reasonable to pursue, but not genuinely good in the moral sense. Virtue alone is good. Vice alone is evil. Everything else is indifferent to happiness, though not indifferent to preference. You should work to escape poverty if possible, help others escape it, create systems that reduce it. But you should not stake your happiness on success in these endeavors. The dichotomy faces its hardest test with severe suffering. Can someone being tortured maintain happiness through right judgment alone? Can concentration camp prisoners achieve tranquility by focusing on what remains under their control? Epictetus would say yes in principle, though such cases push proheresis to its limits. Viktor Frankl's account of surviving Auschwitz suggests something similar. Frankl observed that prisoners who maintain meaning and purpose showed remarkable resilience despite unimaginable external horrors. Their final freedom, the freedom to choose their attitude towards suffering, could not be taken from them. But we should be cautious here. Extreme suffering can damage the brain structures that enable rational choice. Prolonged torture can induce psychosis, destroying cognitive function. Starvation degrades prefrontal cortex performance, impairing executive function. The dichotomy assumes a minimally functional prohairesis, which extreme circumstances can destroy. This reveals a limitation Epictetus doesn't fully acknowledge. The capacity for rational choice depends on biological substrates that can be damaged or destroyed. Your prohairesis is not completely invulnerable to external harm. Brain injury, neurological disease, severe malnutrition, and extreme psychological trauma can all compromise the faculty of choice itself. Modern critics also challenge the dichotomy's sharpness. Many important things involve both internal and external elements in ways that resist clean separation. Consider a committed relationship. Whether you choose to act with love and fidelity is entirely up to you. Whether your partner does the same is entirely up to them. But the relationship itself exists between you, depending on both parties' sustained choices. Should you be indifferent to whether your relationship continues? Epictetus would say you should value your own loving character, which is under your control. But you should recognize that the relationship's continuation depends partly on your partner's choices, which are external to you. Therefore, you should pursue the relationship rationally, but not stake your happiness on its success. If your partner chooses to leave despite your best efforts, you should accept this without devastation. Critics find this psychologically unrealistic and morally concerning. Can you really love someone while maintaining complete emotional independence from whether they reciprocate? Doesn't genuine love involve vulnerability, risking your happiness on another person? Epictetus would respond that what critics call love is often possessive attachment disguised as virtue. Real love wants the other's genuine good and respects their freedom to choose. If you become devastated by their choices, you are treating them as means to your happiness rather than ends in themselves. You love them not for themselves, but for what they provide you. This connects to the Stoic analysis of emotions as judgments. Devastation at a relationship's end reflects the judgment that you need this person for happiness, that their presence is genuinely good for you. But this judgment is false according to Stoic ethics. No external object is genuinely good in the sense of being necessary for happiness. Only your own virtue is genuinely good, and you retain that regardless of what others choose. Whether this analysis is correct remains debatable, but it's more sophisticated than simple emotional suppression. Epictetus argues for transforming emotions by transforming the judgments that generate them, not for eliminating feeling entirely. The wise person feels what Stoics call good emotions, rational affective responses like joy at virtue and caution toward vice. The dichotomy of control ultimately serves a practical purpose. It directs your attention and effort toward what you can actually influence. Worrying about uncontrollable outcomes wastes cognitive resources and generates unnecessary suffering. Focusing on controllable choices empowers you and increases your effectiveness. This aligns with modern stress research. Perceived control over stressors significantly reduces their psychological and physiological impact. Workers with more autonomy report less stress even when workload is high. Patients with more control over pain medication require lower doses for the same relief. The dichotomy provides a systematic method for determining what you can control. Ask whether the thing in question depends entirely on your prohairesis or involves external factors. If it involves external factors, recognize it as not fully yours and adjust your emotional investment accordingly. If it depends entirely on your prohairesis, take full responsibility and direct your effort there. Part 3. The use of impressions. Prohairesis operates through a specific practice Epictetus calls the correct use of impressions, krisis ton phantasian. This is not abstract theory, but practical technique, a learnable skill for managing mental life. Impressions arise constantly and automatically in consciousness. You see a face, and the impression beautiful appears. You smell food, and the impression delicious arises. Someone criticizes you, and the impression insulted emerges. These impressions are not choices, but events that happen to you, determined by sensory input and prior conditioning. Each impression carries implicit value judgments and action tendencies. The impression beautiful suggests pursuit, creating desire to obtain or maintain proximity to the beautiful object. The impression delicious generates appetite, an impulse to eat. The impression insulted triggers aversion, an impulse to retaliate or withdraw. Animals respond to impressions immediately and unreflectively. The dog smells food and approaches without deliberation. The deer senses danger and flees without evaluating whether the threat is real. Humans possess the capacity to pause between impression and response, examining whether the impression's implicit claims are true. The correct use of impressions requires 3 sequential operations. First, recognize that an impression has appeared. Second, withhold immediate assent while examining its content. Third, accept or reject the impression based on whether it aligns with reality and reason. Epictetus instructs students to apostrophize impressions, addressing them directly as external objects. Wait a while for me, my impression. Let me see what you are and what you represent. Let me test you. This creates what modern psychology calls cognitive diffusion, separating yourself from the mental event. Consider the impression that someone's criticism has harmed you. The automatic response is to feel hurt or angry, accepting the impression's claim as true. The correct use of impressions intervenes in this automaticity. You notice the impression arising without immediately believing it. You examine whether criticism actually harms you in any meaningful sense. What did the criticism change? Your body remains intact, your capacities unchanged, your moral character unaffected by someone else's words. Perhaps your reputation suffered, but reputation is external, not fully under your control, not genuinely good or evil. The criticism revealed the critic's judgment, which belongs to them and reflects their character, not yours. Having examined the impression, you recognize it as false. The criticism did not actually harm you. You experienced an impression of harm, which you can now reject. This doesn't mean you ignore the criticism entirely. Perhaps it contains useful feedback you should consider. But you separate the information from the evaluative claim that you have been damaged. This practice directly parallels cognitive restructuring in cognitive behavioral therapy. CBT teaches clients to identify automatic thoughts, which are impressions in Stoic language. These automatic thoughts often contain cognitive distortions, systematic errors in processing information. Catastrophizing sees worst-case scenarios as inevitable. All-or-nothing thinking imposes false dichotomies. Personalization attributes external events to personal failings. The CBT client learns to notice automatic thoughts without accepting them as truth. They examine the evidence for and against the thought's claim. They consider alternative interpretations of the situation. They test whether the thought follows logically from the facts. This evaluation process mirrors Epictetus's examination of impressions, determining whether they merit assent. Neuroscience reveals the neural mechanism underlying this practice. Automatic impressions activate subcortical emotional circuits, particularly the amygdala, for threat-related content. This activation happens within 200 milliseconds of stimulus presentation, far faster than conscious deliberation. The initial emotional response therefore occurs before you can evaluate it. But the emotional response can be regulated through prefrontal mechanisms. When you notice an impression and examine it consciously, you activate lateral prefrontal cortex. This region can modulate amygdala activity through inhibitory connections, reducing the intensity of emotional responses. Studies using fMRI show that cognitive reappraisal, reinterpreting emotional stimuli in neutral terms, increases prefrontal activation while decreasing amygdala activation. The temporal dynamics matter critically here. The initial impression and emotional reaction occur before conscious intervention is possible. Epictetus recognizes this. He doesn't say you can prevent impressions from arising or stop initial emotional responses. He says you can intervene after the impression appears, but before you fully assent to it and act on it. This window for intervention is real but brief. Research on emotion regulation shows that reappraisal works best when applied early in the emotional response process. If you wait until an emotion has fully activated and behavioral responses have begun, cognitive control becomes much harder. The impression already has momentum, neural pathways already activated, attention already narrowed. Therefore, the correct use of impressions requires vigilance and practice. You must train yourself to notice impressions quickly before they gain full control of attention and behavior. This is cognitive habit formation, strengthening specific neural pathways through repetition. Each time you successfully pause and examine an impression, you reinforce the circuitry that enables cognitive control. Epictetus emphasizes that not all impressions require elaborate examination. Many impressions accurately represent reality and deserve immediate assent. You see a tree, and the impression tree appears. You can accept this immediately in most contexts because perception is generally reliable for obvious physical objects. The impressions requiring careful examination are those carrying strong emotional content or value judgments about good and evil. The impression that losing money is terrible demands scrutiny. The impression that being insulted is harmful warrants examination. The impression that pleasure is genuinely good needs testing against reason. These evaluative impressions often conflict with Stoic principles about where value truly resides. Common opinion treats wealth, health, reputation, and pleasure as genuinely good. Stoic philosophy argues that only virtue is genuinely good, only vice is genuinely evil. Everything else is indifferent, though some indifferents are preferred over others. The correct use of impressions, therefore, involves applying philosophical principles to evaluate content. When an impression claims that some external object is good or evil, you test it against the dichotomy of control. Is this object under my control? No, it's external. Then it cannot be genuinely good or evil, because my happiness cannot depend on what I don't control. This creates a systematic method for managing mental life. Every impression gets sorted into categories. Impressions about externals deserve acceptance as facts, but rejection as value claims. It's true that you lost money, but false that this loss is genuinely bad for you. It's true that someone insulted you, but false that the insult harmed you. Critics object that this systematically distorts reality. If you reject all negative evaluations of external events, haven't you just convinced yourself that nothing bad ever happens? Doesn't this make you indifferent to real suffering, both yours and others? If losing your health isn't bad, why work to maintain it? If others' suffering isn't bad, why help them? Epictetus anticipates this objection. He distinguishes between what is genuinely good in the absolute sense and what is preferred among indifferents. Health is not genuinely good, but it is naturally preferred, something you rationally pursue when possible. You should take care of your body, seek medical treatment when ill, maintain physical fitness. But you should recognize that health is not necessary for happiness, not genuinely good in the technical Stoic sense. The same applies to others' well-being. You should actively work to reduce suffering and promote human flourishing. This follows from your social nature and the roles you occupy. But you should not become emotionally devastated when your efforts fail, when people suffer despite your help. Their suffering is an external, something you influence but don't fully control. Your virtue in trying to help them is internal, fully under your control, and sufficient for your happiness. The practice of examining impressions extends to judgments about your own character. You fail at an important task, and the impression arises that you are worthless, incompetent, a failure. This impression demands immediate scrutiny. You failed at one task, true. Does this single failure define your entire character? Does it erase all your capabilities and past successes? The impression conflates a particular action with global self-worth. This is a cognitive distortion, overgeneralization in CBT terms. The correct use of impressions separates fact from interpretation. You failed at this specific task in these specific circumstances. What can you learn from this failure? How can you improve for next time? These questions focus on what you control going forward rather than global judgments about your worth. Depression characteristically involves accepting negative impressions about the self without examination. The depressed mind generates automatic thoughts like, I'm worthless, nothing good will ever happen, it's all hopeless. These thoughts feel completely true, self-evident, not requiring verification. The depressed person assents to them immediately and builds their entire worldview on these false foundations. Cognitive therapy for depression is fundamentally training in the correct use of impressions. The therapist helps the client notice automatic thoughts, externalize them, examine them against evidence. Is there evidence supporting this thought? What evidence contradicts it? Would you apply this standard to a friend in similar circumstances? What would be a more balanced way to view the situation? These questions create distance between the person and their thoughts, enabling prohairesis to function. The thought is an impression that appeared, not necessarily truth. It can be examined, tested, accepted or rejected based on evidence and reason. This practice, repeated over weeks and months, can literally rewire neural pathways, reducing depression's grip. Mindfulness practice adds another dimension to using impressions correctly. Mindfulness trains the capacity to observe mental events non-judgmentally, noticing thoughts and feelings without immediately reacting to them. This creates the space Epictetus identifies as necessary for examining impressions before assenting to them. When you practice mindfulness meditation, you notice thoughts arising and passing without getting caught up in their content. A worry appears, you notice it as a mental event, you return attention to the breath. A plan forms, you notice the planning impulse, you let it go without pursuing it. This trains the metacognitive capacity to observe thinking itself, creating psychological distance from thoughts. Neuroscience confirms that mindfulness practice strengthens the neural networks involved in cognitive control. Regular meditators show increased connectivity between prefrontal regions and subcortical emotional circuits. They exhibit greater activity in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex during emotion regulation tasks. Their amygdala shows reduced reactivity to emotional stimuli, even outside meditation. This is prohairesis strengthened through training. The capacity to notice impressions, examine them, and choose whether to accept them improves with practice like any skill. Initially, it requires significant effort, and many impressions slip past before you notice them. With sustained practice, the noticing becomes more automatic, the examination more efficient, the regulation more effective. Epictetus provides specific exercises for training this capacity. Morning preparation involves rehearsing the day ahead and pre-committing to how you'll handle difficult impressions. You know you'll encounter rude people, so you prepare the response in advance. When rudeness appears, you'll remember that this person acts according to their current understanding, however flawed. You'll feel compassion rather than anger, maintaining your own virtue regardless of their behavior. Evening review involves examining the day's events and evaluating your responses. Where did you assent to false impressions? Where did you react emotionally before examining whether the situation truly warranted distress? Where did you act virtuously despite difficult circumstances? This reflective practice reinforces learning, consolidating gains, and identifying areas needing more work. These exercises directly parallel what modern therapy calls cognitive homework. CBT clients keep thought records, noting situations that triggered distress, the automatic thoughts that arose, and more balanced alternative thoughts. They practice cognitive restructuring outside sessions, strengthening the skill through repeated application to real-life situations. They review their progress, identifying patterns and refining techniques. The underlying logic is identical in ancient Stoicism and modern psychotherapy. Mental health requires trained capacity to notice, evaluate, and regulate thoughts and emotions. This capacity strengthens through deliberate practice using specific techniques. Initial attempts are clumsy and effortful, but sustained practice creates new habits that eventually become relatively automatic. The correct use of impressions ultimately aims at freedom from irrational emotions, what Stoics call apatheia. This term is often mistranslated as apathy, suggesting emotional numbness or indifference. But apatheia means freedom from pathos, from passions that disturb rational judgment and arise from false beliefs about good and evil. The wise person in a state of apatheia still experiences emotions, but only rational ones based on correct judgments. They feel joy at virtue, their own and others. They feel caution toward vice, awareness of moral danger without irrational fear. They feel what Stoics call wish, rational preference for obtaining preferred indifference without the passion of craving. What they don't experience is fear of externals, since no external event can truly harm them. They don't experience grief at loss, since they never believed the external object was genuinely good. They don't experience anger at others' choices, since those choices belong entirely to those people and don't affect the wise person's genuine well-being. Whether humans can actually achieve this ideal state remains questionable. Epictetus admits that reaching perfect wisdom is extraordinarily rare, perhaps never fully realized. But the ideal serves as a target for development, a direction for practice even if final mastery proves elusive. Each increment of progress reduces unnecessary suffering and increases rational agency. Part 4. The 3 Disciplines of Training. Epictetus organizes philosophical education into 3 progressive fields of study he calls topics or topoi. Each topic develops a different aspect of prohairesis, targeting specific vulnerabilities to error and passion. The first topic concerns desire and aversion, orexis and eklesis. This addresses what you pursue and what you avoid, where you locate value and disvalue. The second topic concerns impulse and repulsion, horme and aphorm, governing appropriate action in your various roles. The third topic concerns assent and denial, sankatathesis and anasankatathesis, achieving certainty and avoiding error in judgment. These topics are not independent modules, but interconnected dimensions of unified training. Together, they constitute comprehensive philosophical therapy, reshaping how you think, feel, and act. The topic of desire and aversion targets the most fundamental source of human suffering. We desire things we don't control and feel devastated when we don't obtain them. We avoid things we don't control and feel distressed when we encounter them anyway. Ordinary people desire wealth, health, reputation, pleasure, and success. They avoid poverty, illness, disgrace, pain, and failure. But all these objects lie partly or wholly outside their control, depending on fortune, other people's choices, and natural processes. Therefore, their happiness becomes hostage to external circumstances that may or may not cooperate with their desires. The result is perpetual anxiety. You desire something you don't yet have, creating fear that you won't obtain it. You obtain it, creating fear that you'll lose it. You lose it, creating grief and renewed fear that you won't regain it. The cycle continues endlessly as long as desire targets externals. Epictetus prescribes radical reorientation. Desire only what is always under your control, namely your own virtue and correct use of prohairesis. Avoid only what is under your control, namely your own vice and misuse of prohairesis. Regarding everything else, maintain rational preference without passionate desire or aversion. This sounds emotionally barren until you grasp its logic. If you desire only virtue, you can always succeed because virtue depends entirely on your choices. No external obstacle can prevent you from choosing virtuously in whatever circumstances you face. If you avoid only vice, you can always succeed, because vice also depends entirely on your choices. No external force can compel you to choose viciously against your will. Your happiness, therefore, becomes unconditionally secure, independent of fortune's fluctuations. You might prefer wealth but not desire it as genuinely good. Losing wealth becomes a preferred, indifferent lost rather than a genuine good lost. The emotional impact differs dramatically. Disappointment rather than devastation, mild regret rather than existential crisis. Modern psychology confirms that desires create suffering through mechanisms Epictetus identified. When you desire an outcome intensely, you create emotional investment in something uncertain. The uncertainty generates anxiety, the investment magnifies disappointment, and the combination can trigger depression when desire is thwarted. The hedonic treadmill ensures that obtaining desired objects provides only temporary satisfaction before desire resets to new targets. Research on materialism demonstrates this vividly. People who strongly desire wealth and possessions report lower life satisfaction and higher rates of anxiety and depression. This holds even for wealthy individuals who have obtained what they desire. The problem isn't lack of resources, but the orientation of desire toward externals that never fully satisfy. Conversely, people who orient their goals toward internal growth, meaningful relationships, and contribution to others report higher well-being. These goals depend more heavily on their own choices and less on external circumstances. Success becomes more controllable, failure less devastating, and the process itself more rewarding than merely obtaining a target. The first topic's training involves systematically examining each desire and aversion. What exactly do I desire here? Is it truly under my control, or does it depend partly on externals? If it depends on externals, can I reframe my desire to target only the internal component? Instead of desiring success in business, can I desire to work skillfully and ethically, accepting whatever outcomes follow? This reframing doesn't eliminate engagement with the world. You still work hard, make plans, pursue objectives. But you locate value in your effort and integrity, rather than in the outcome itself. Success becomes a preferred outcome you pursue rationally, not a good you desperately need. The second topic addresses appropriate action, duties emerging from your various roles and relationships. You occupy multiple roles simultaneously: human being, citizen, child, parent, friend, professional. Each role generates specific duties, and roles sometimes conflict in their demands. Epictetus develops role ethics far more extensively than earlier Stoics. He argues that understanding your specific roles and their requirements is crucial for determining right action in particular circumstances. As a human being, you have general duties applying to everyone, pursuing reason, living virtuously, recognizing your kinship with all rational beings. As a citizen, you have duties to your political community, obeying just laws, contributing to the common good, participating in civic life. As a child, you owe honor and care to your parents, even if they treat you poorly. As a parent, you owe love and proper education to your children, even if they prove ungrateful. What makes these roles duties rather than optional preferences? Epictetus grounds role duties in human nature as a social animal designed by Zeus to live in communities. Your flourishing inherently involves other people, and roles articulate the structure of human social relationships. Fulfilling your roles well expresses your nature, constitutes living according to nature as a human being. Modern critics find this naturalistic grounding problematic. Why should the fact that humans evolved as social animals imply moral duties? Why can't you simply pursue self-interest and ignore social bonds? Epictetus would respond that pure self-interest is psychologically impossible and conceptually incoherent for social beings. Your identity is partly constituted by your relationships. You understand yourself as someone's child, someone's friend, a member of particular communities. These relationships shape your goals, your conception of the good, your sense of meaning. Trying to strip them away and pursue pure self-interest would destroy the self doing the pursuing. Contemporary virtue ethics, particularly care ethics, makes similar arguments. We are fundamentally relational beings whose identity emerges through connections with others. Obligations to care for those we are connected with aren't external constraints on self-interest, but internal to what selfhood means. A mother who views feeding her hungry child as a sacrifice to self-interest has fundamentally misunderstood what being a mother involves. The second topic trains you to identify which roles apply in each situation and what they demand. Role conflicts create ethical dilemmas, requiring practical wisdom to navigate. Your duty as a friend might conflict with your duty as a citizen when a friend breaks the law. Your duty as a parent might conflict with your duty as a professional when work demands interfere with family time. Epictetus doesn't provide algorithmic solutions to these conflicts. He emphasizes that philosophical training develops your capacity for practical judgment, your ability to weigh competing considerations wisely. The goal is not to memorize rules, but to become the kind of person who habitually chooses well when roles conflict. This training involves case studies, examining examples from history, literature, and student experiences. What would Socrates have done in this situation? What did this historical figure do, and was it right or wrong? How should you respond when your employer demands dishonest practices? When your parent needs care, but you have career ambitions? The method mirrors modern professional ethics training and clinical case conferences. You develop ethical sensitivity by working through concrete cases that force you to articulate principles and consider their application. Initially, you rely on explicit reasoning, consciously weighing considerations and testing proposals. Gradually, through repeated practice, you develop intuitions that allow quicker recognition of the right response. Neuroscience suggests this transition from explicit to implicit operates through striatal learning mechanisms. The prefrontal cortex initially controls deliberate ethical reasoning, consciously evaluating options against principles. With practice, the striatum learns associations between situation types and appropriate responses, enabling faster, more automatic ethical judgment. The expert's intuition reflects accumulated learning compressed into efficient neural representations. The third topic addresses assent, the epistemic dimension of prohairesis. Even if you desire the right things and choose appropriate actions, you can still err by accepting false impressions as true. This topic has two aspects. First, avoiding rash assent by examining impressions carefully before accepting them. Second, achieving firm conviction in true principles through rigorous demonstration and proof. The first aspect we've already explored in discussing the use of impressions. Don't accept evaluative claims without testing them against reason and the dichotomy of control. Don't confuse appearances with reality, impressions with facts. Examine carefully before judging something good, evil, or indifferent. The second aspect involves formal logic and philosophical demonstration. Epictetus believes you need not just true beliefs, but understanding of why they're true, and confidence they cannot be shaken by sophistry. Imagine you believe that virtue is the only good based on your teacher's authority. A clever Epicurean challenges you, presenting arguments that pleasure is the true good. If you can't defend your belief with rigorous reasoning, you might abandon it, or at least suffer uncertainty that undermines its practical effectiveness. The third topic trains you to construct and evaluate arguments, detect fallacies, and demonstrate conclusions rigorously. This includes formal logic, the study of valid inference patterns. It also includes dialectic, the method of questioning that exposes contradictions and tests beliefs through challenge. Epictetus draws this directly from Socrates, whose cross-examination method appears constantly in the discourses. When a student makes a claim, Epictetus questions it relentlessly, exposing unstated assumptions and logical gaps. The goal is not to humiliate, but to strengthen understanding by forcing articulation of the reasoning behind beliefs. Modern critical thinking education aims at similar competencies. Students learn to identify premises and conclusions, evaluate evidence quality, detect informal fallacies, construct sound arguments. These skills protect against manipulation by faulty reasoning, whether from others or your own mind's shortcuts and biases. Epictetus acknowledges tension between the three topics. Someone might achieve perfect logical skill, able to detect every fallacy and construct flawless demonstrations while remaining vicious in character. Conversely, someone might live virtuously, fulfilling all their duties while holding their beliefs on weak grounds vulnerable to sophistic attack. He insists that all three topics are necessary for complete philosophical development. The first topic establishes what to value, orienting desire correctly. The second topic determines how to act, fulfilling your roles virtuously. The third topic secures your beliefs, making your virtue stable and unshakable. But he also maintains that the topics have different priority for students at different stages. Beginners should focus primarily on the first topic, reorienting desire away from externals. Until you've made progress there, the other topics cannot gain traction. You'll use logical skills to rationalize vice and perform duties reluctantly rather than joyfully. Once you've achieved some reorientation of desire, you can progress to the second topic, learning to act appropriately from better motivations. Only advanced students, those who have made substantial progress in desire and action, benefit fully from intensive logical training. For them, the third topic completes development by securing epistemic certainty in principles they already live by. This staged approach mirrors modern therapeutic and educational progressions. You can't teach someone complex problem-solving before they've mastered basic skills. You can't successfully implement advanced cognitive techniques if someone's in acute crisis from disordered motivations. Sequencing matters tremendously for effective learning and therapeutic change. Critics question whether Epictetus's own practice matched his theory of the three topics. The surviving discourses focus overwhelmingly on desire and action, with relatively little formal logical instruction. Perhaps Epictetus adapted his teaching to his students' level, emphasizing foundational topics most students needed. Perhaps our surviving texts don't represent the full curriculum he taught across years of study. Or perhaps Epictetus came to believe that logical training, while valuable in principle, matters less practically than earlier Stoics thought. His student base included Romans seeking practical philosophy for living well, not professional philosophers pursuing theoretical precision. For this audience, transformation of desire and action took priority over logical sophistication. This raises a deeper question about Stoicism's evolution from early theoretical emphasis to later practical focus. The early Stoa produced elaborate treatises on logic, physics, and ethics as interconnected theoretical systems. By Epictetus's time, Stoicism had become primarily a therapeutic practice addressing psychological suffering and ethical formation. Did this shift represent corruption of original Stoic philosophy or natural adaptation to new contexts and audiences? Scholars debate this vigorously. Some argue that practical focus betrayed Stoicism's systematic philosophical ambitions, reducing it to mere self-help advice. Others contend that the practical turn realized Stoicism's original purpose more fully, making it effective therapy rather than abstract theory. The three topics provide a comprehensive framework for philosophical education regardless of which position is correct. They cover the essential dimensions of human psychology that require training: motivation, behavior, and cognition. Any complete therapeutic or educational system must address all three, though emphasis may vary by context and student needs. Part 5. Living according to nature. The Stoic prescription to live according to nature seems simple until you examine what nature means here. Nature operates at multiple levels in Stoic philosophy, each generating ethical implications. First, there is universal nature, the cosmos itself as a rationally ordered and divine system. Second, there is human nature, specifically our constitution as rational social animals. Third, there is individual nature, your particular talents, limitations, and circumstances. Living according to nature means aligning yourself with all three levels simultaneously. You recognize the cosmic order and accept your place within it. You develop your rational and social capacities fully. You understand and accept your individual constitution, working within its parameters. Epictetus speaks constantly of Zeus, God, divine providence, and fate. These terms describe the same reality from different perspectives, the rational principle that orders the universe. Zeus is not a separate being who created the cosmos and rules it from outside. Zeus is immanent in nature, identical with the rational structure that pervades all things. The universe is a living organism animated by reason, what Stoics call the logos. This logos is both the rational order of events and the divine intelligence directing them. Every event happens according to fate, the necessary unfolding of causal chains determined by universal reason. Nothing occurs randomly or without cause. Every detail fits into a comprehensive, rational plan. Modern readers immediately resist this cosmic optimism. If the universe is rationally ordered by divine providence, why does it contain so much suffering, injustice, and evil? How can you claim that everything happens for the best when children get cancer, innocents suffer torture, natural disasters destroy communities? Epictetus has several responses that don't fully satisfy critics. First, what appears evil is not genuinely evil, because only vice is genuinely evil, and vice cannot be inflicted externally. The child's cancer is a bodily affliction, a preferred indifferent lost, not a genuine evil. The real evil would be responding to cancer viciously, with despair that leads to cruelty or cowardice. Second, particular evils serve larger goods, invisible from our limited perspective. Zeus has a comprehensive view that we lack, understanding how each event fits into the whole. What seems pointless suffering to us might serve essential purposes in the cosmic order. We should trust divine wisdom, even when we cannot see the purpose ourselves. Third, accepting fate doesn't mean passively allowing suffering to continue unchallenged. Your role might be to fight disease, oppose injustice, prevent harm to others. Living according to nature includes fulfilling these roles energetically. You accept that outcomes depend partly on factors outside your control, but you don't accept that you should do nothing. These responses satisfy few modern philosophers. The argument that bodily suffering is not genuinely evil seems to deny obvious facts about what makes life go badly. The appeal to hidden divine purposes that we should trust without evidence sounds like rationalization rather than genuine explanation. The claim that we should both accept fate and work to change outcomes appears contradictory. But understanding Epictetus's arguments requires grasping his underlying metaphysical commitments about determinism and compatibilism. He accepts universal causal determinism. Every event has prior causes that necessitate it, stretching back to the beginning of time. Your choices are among these determined events caused by your character, beliefs and circumstances. Given who you are and what you believe, you could not choose otherwise than you do. Yet Epictetus also insists that you are free, that your choices are genuinely up to you, that you are responsible for them. How can both be true? He adopts what philosophers call compatibilism, the view that determinism is compatible with freedom and responsibility. Freedom doesn't require that your choices be uncaused or that you could have chosen otherwise given identical prior conditions. Freedom requires that your choices flow from your own rational nature rather than being compelled by external forces. When you choose based on your beliefs and desires, your choice is free, even if those beliefs and desires were themselves determined by prior causes. When external force compels you to act against your beliefs and desires, your action is not free. A prisoner who chooses to maintain integrity while imprisoned is free in the relevant sense. A person whose arm is physically forced to sign a document against their will is not free. Modern compatibilists make similar arguments using different terminology. Daniel Dennett argues that freedom is the capacity to choose based on reasons, to have your behavior guided by rational considerations. This capacity doesn't require exemption from causality. It requires the right kind of causal process, one that involves evaluation of reasons rather than simple stimulus-response mechanisms. Neuroscience reveals the physical basis for this capacity. Prefrontal cortex enables deliberation, weighing options against goals and values before acting. This deliberative process is entirely physical, implemented by neural circuits, determined by prior brain states and inputs. But it's also the process that makes rational agency possible, that gives us meaningful control over our actions. The debate between compatibilism and libertarian free will remains unresolved in philosophy. Libertarians argue that genuine freedom requires indeterminism, that your choices must not be fully determined by prior causes. They find compatibilist freedom too weak, more like sophisticated deterministic mechanism than real agency. Compatibilists respond that libertarian freedom is incoherent, requiring uncaused choices that would be random rather than free. Epictetus's position is clearly compatibilist, though he never engages the debate in these terms. He needs compatibilism to maintain both Stoic physics, which posits universal determinism, and Stoic ethics, which requires genuine responsibility for choices. Living according to universal nature means accepting fate joyfully, recognizing that everything happens according to Zeus's rational plan. When events go contrary to your preferences, you remember that Zeus has arranged them for some good purpose, even if you cannot discern it. You accept without resistance, maintaining equanimity regardless of circumstances. Critics find this attitude morally problematic. Shouldn't you resist injustice rather than accepting it as part of Zeus's plan? Shouldn't you fight against suffering rather than maintaining equanimity toward it? Epictetus distinguishes between accepting that an event has occurred and ceasing to work against similar events in the future. Once the event has happened, resistance is irrational because you cannot change the past. Emotional turmoil about what has already occurred serves no purpose beyond disturbing your peace. But working to prevent similar events in the future is entirely rational and often required by your roles. A Stoic who experiences injustice accepts that this particular injustice has occurred, maintaining equanimity about a past they cannot change. But the same Stoic works vigorously to prevent future injustice, fulfilling their role as a citizen and human being. Acceptance applies to what has already happened, not to what you should pursue going forward. Living according to human nature means developing your distinctive human capacities, particularly reason and sociability. Humans are rational animals, possessing logos, the divine spark that connects us to Zeus. Therefore, human flourishing consists fundamentally in exercising reason excellently, which is virtue. To live according to human nature is to live virtuously. Humans are also social animals by nature, designed for community. Your flourishing inherently involves other people and requires fulfilling your social roles appropriately. Trying to live in pure isolation, pursuing only self-interest without regard for others, would violate your nature as a social being. Epictetus extends this to argue for cosmopolitanism, the view that all rational beings are citizens of a single cosmic city. Your primary political community is not your particular nation, but the universal community of gods and humans. This generates duties to all rational beings simply because they share your rational nature, regardless of their nationality, ethnicity, or social status. This cosmopolitan stance was radical in the Roman Empire and remains challenging today. We naturally favour our own families, communities and nations over distant strangers, gap. Epictetus doesn't deny these special obligations to those near us, but he insists that our concern should extend to all humanity as members of a single family under Zeus. Modern moral psychology confirms that we possess both parochial and universal moral sentiments. We feel intense concern for our children and community members, motivating sacrifice on their behalf. We also feel some concern for distant strangers, supporting humanitarian aid and feeling distress at reports of distant suffering. The challenge is strengthening universal concern enough to motivate appropriate action without weakening special obligations. Effective altruism attempts this by combining rational calculation of how to do the most good with emotionally engaging examples of individuals helped. But the tension between partiality and impartiality in ethics remains unresolved, theoretically and practically. Living according to individual nature means accepting your particular constitution and circumstances. You were born with certain talents, certain limitations, into certain circumstances you did not choose. This is your individual nature, your specific allotment from Zeus. Resenting it or wishing you had a different nature wastes energy on what you cannot change. Epictetus uses the metaphor of an assigned role in a play. Zeus assigns each person a role to perform in the cosmic drama. Gap. Your job is to perform your assigned role excellently, not to wish you had a different role. The actor playing a beggar performs that role well or badly. The quality of the performance, not the status of the character, determines excellence. This seems to counsel passive acceptance of unjust social hierarchies. If Zeus assigned you to slavery, should you accept that and simply try to be an excellent slave? Epictetus himself was enslaved, yet later freed, so clearly he didn't think slaves should never pursue freedom. But the emphasis on accepting your assigned role has conservative implications that trouble modern readers. The charitable interpretation is that Epictetus distinguishes between your internal response to circumstances and your external efforts to change them. You should not base your happiness on changing circumstances you might never escape. This would make you psychologically dependent on outcomes outside your control. But you can rationally work toward changing unjust circumstances while maintaining equanimity about current conditions. The less charitable interpretation is that Epictetus genuinely believed social hierarchies reflect divine assignment and should be accepted as just. The emphasis on fulfilling assigned roles rather than questioning the assignment itself supports existing power structures. This made Stoicism attractive to Roman elites who benefited from those structures, even as it offered psychological comfort to those suffering under them. The concept of living according to nature faces a fundamental problem in modern philosophy. We cannot derive aught from his moral conclusions from purely factual premises. Even if humans are naturally rational and social, why does this imply we ought to develop these capacities? Even if the universe follows deterministic laws, why should we accept this rather than rebelling against it? Epictetus would reject the sharp distinction between fact and value. To understand what something truly is requires understanding its function, its telos, its natural end state. A knife's nature includes its function of cutting, because that's what knives are designed for. A human's nature includes the function of exercising reason, because that's what humans are designed for by Zeus. But this teleological framework only works if you accept that the universe has intentional design. Modern science has abandoned teleology in nature, explaining biological functions through evolution by natural selection rather than design by a creator. Our rational and social capacities are evolutionary adaptations that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce, not gifts from Zeus for us to perfect. Does evolution provide grounds for ethics as robust as divine design? Some philosophers argue yes. We should develop our evolved capacities because doing so promotes flourishing, given how we're constructed. Others argue no. Evolution optimized us for reproductive success in ancestral environments, not for flourishing in modern contexts or for moral goodness. This debate matters for evaluating Epictetus's arguments. If living according to nature simply means acknowledging and working with our actual psychological constitution, many of his insights remain valid. We are indeed social animals who suffer when isolated, rational beings who function better with cognitive control over emotions, creatures who flourish by developing stable, virtuous character. These are facts about human psychology that ethics should accommodate. But if living according to nature requires believing in cosmic providence and divine intention, modern scientific worldviews undercut the foundation. We can keep Epictetus's practical techniques while abandoning his metaphysics, as cognitive behavioral therapy does. But we lose the comprehensive philosophical framework that unified his physics, logic, and ethics into a single coherent system. Part 6. Role, Ethics, and Social Bonds. Epictetus's account of social relationships may be his most original contribution to Stoic philosophy. Earlier, Stoics developed extensive theories of appropriate action and social duties, but Epictetus makes role the central organizing concept of his practical ethics. You are never simply a human being in abstract. You are always someone's child, possibly someone's parent, friend, citizen, professional. These roles are not external to your identity, but constitute it. Who you are is largely determined by what roles you occupy and how you fulfill them. Each role generates specific duties that apply when you occupy it. As a child, you owe respect and care to your parents, regardless of whether they deserve it by their behavior. As a parent, you owe love and proper education to your children, regardless of whether they prove grateful. As a friend, you owe loyalty and truth-telling, even when lies would be more convenient. The duties are not conditional on reciprocity. You perform them because of who you are, your role identity, not because of what you'll receive in return. This distinguishes Stoic ethics sharply from contractarian approaches that ground duties in mutual advantage. Your obligations to your parents don't disappear if they mistreat you because the duty flows from your role as child, not from an implicit contract they might have violated. Modern critics find this problematic in cases of severe abuse. Does an adult child really owe care to a parent who abused them in childhood? Gap. Doesn't the emphasis on role duties enable ongoing abuse by denying victims the right to withdraw from harmful relationships? Epictetus would respond that roles have natural limits. Your duty as a child is to respect your parent as a human being and rational agent, to wish them well and help them when appropriate. It's not to submit to ongoing abuse or to maintain relationship closeness that enables harm. You can fulfill your basic duty as a child while setting necessary boundaries for your protection. But the texts don't fully develop this boundary question, perhaps because Epictetus lived in a culture with strong expectations of filial piety that limited his vision. Modern applications of Stoic role ethics need to articulate more clearly when role duties permit or require ending relationships. Roles can conflict, creating ethical dilemmas with no obvious resolution. Your duty as a citizen might require reporting illegal activity by your friend, violating your duty as a friend to maintain confidentiality. Your duty as a professional might demand time and energy that conflicts with your duty as a parent to be present for your children. Your duty to truth as a philosopher might conflict with your duty to compassion as a friend when a harsh truth would devastate someone you care for. Epictetus provides no algorithm for resolving these conflicts. He emphasizes that ethical wisdom consists precisely in the ability to navigate such dilemmas well, judging correctly which duty takes priority in particular circumstances. Sometimes one role clearly supersedes others based on the stakes involved. Your duty as a human being not to commit murder overrides any role-specific duty that might demand it. Your duty as a citizen to prevent serious crimes might override your duty as a friend to protect them from consequences. But many conflicts involve competing goods rather than clear hierarchies. Both your children and your work deserve attention, and both contribute to your flourishing. Wisdom requires balancing them well, giving each appropriate attention without sacrificing either completely. This is practical judgment exercised in concrete situations, not theoretical application of abstract principles. Aristotle's concept of phronesis, practical wisdom, describes this capacity. The practically wise person has developed through experience and reflection the ability to discern what situations require. They recognize salient features that indicate which considerations matter most, balancing competing goods proportionally. This is a perceptual skill more than a calculative one, trained through practice rather than learned from rules. Modern virtue ethics attempts to articulate how this practical wisdom develops and operates. Rosalind Hursthouse argues that virtue ethics doesn't provide a decision procedure, but rather identifies the kinds of considerations that matter morally. The virtuous person attends to these considerations and weights them appropriately, but exactly how to weight them in novel situations requires situated judgment. Neuroscience confirms that expert ethical judgment engages different neural systems than novice ethical reasoning. Novices rely heavily on prefrontal deliberative systems, consciously applying principles and calculating consequences. Experts show more automatic responses mediated by ventromedial prefrontal cortex and striatum, suggesting internalized evaluations that don't require conscious deliberation. The expert's intuition reflects accumulated experience compressed into efficient neural representations. Epictetus presents Socrates as the paradigm of practical wisdom in navigating role conflicts. When Athens condemned Socrates to death, he could have escaped, but chose to accept execution. His role as a citizen required obeying the city's laws even when they commanded injustice. His role as a philosopher required witnessing to truth through his death more powerfully than he could through escape. Modern readers often find Socrates' choice perverse. Why obey an unjust law requiring your own death? Gap. Wouldn't escaping and continuing to teach philosophy serve both truth and life better than dying for obedience to a corrupt verdict? The Stoic interpretation emphasizes that Socrates understood his death as necessary for maintaining the integrity that made his teaching effective. If he violated the law he had previously obeyed, his whole philosophy would be exposed as merely theoretical, abandoned when personally costly. His death demonstrated that he lived what he taught, that virtue mattered more than life itself, that commitment to principle was genuine. This connects to Stoic views on moral exemplars and role models. You develop virtue partly by studying how exemplars navigated challenges, what they chose and why, what we can learn from their examples. Socrates serves as the primary exemplar because his life and death perfectly instantiated philosophical integrity carried to its ultimate test. Role ethics raises questions about identity and authenticity. If roles constitute your identity, are you simply the sum of social expectations and relationships? Where is there space for individual authenticity, for being true to yourself apart from roles? Epictetus would challenge the concept of self apart from roles as incoherent. Your self is not some essence existing independently of all relationships and social contexts. It's constituted through those relationships, developed through living in community, expressed through fulfilling roles excellently or poorly. This doesn't mean roles are fixed, or that you can't question whether you should occupy particular roles. You can recognize that some roles don't fit you well or make demands incompatible with other, more central roles. You can exit roles when appropriate, like leaving a job that requires dishonesty or ending a friendship that has become toxic. But even these decisions are made from within other roles. You leave the dishonest job as someone who values integrity more than money, a role-based identity, even if not a conventional social role. You end the toxic friendship as someone committed to health and virtue, again expressing a role-based understanding of who you are and what you owe yourself. Contemporary care ethics makes related arguments about relational identity. Nell Noddings argues that we are fundamentally relational beings whose identity emerges through caring relationships. The illusion of an atomic individual existing prior to relationships is a philosophical fiction that distorts moral reality. We become ourselves through relationships, and our obligations flow from these constitutive connections. Epictetus extends role ethics to include what we might call aspirational or vocational roles. Some people are called to philosophy, meaning they should center their lives around philosophical inquiry and teaching. Others are called to medicine, to politics, to various crafts and professions that constitute their primary role beyond basic human roles everyone shares. How do you discern your calling? Epictetus points to natural aptitude, what you're capable of doing well. He emphasizes divine assignment, the particular circumstances and opportunities Zeus has arranged for you. He notes that your calling should align with your talents and circumstances, not represent wishful thinking about roles unavailable to you. A person with talent for philosophy but circumstances that prevent study might fulfill the philosophical role through reading and reflecting privately. Someone with circumstances supporting philosophical education but lacking real aptitude might better pursue a different calling. This resonates with modern concepts of vocation and career fit. Research on job satisfaction shows that matching your work to your strengths and values produces better outcomes than pursuing conventionally prestigious careers unsuited to your abilities. People flourish when their roles allow them to develop and express their capabilities in service of meaningful goals. But Epictetus's framework remains limited by his historical context in potentially troubling ways. He accepts slavery as a natural institution, never questioning whether this role should exist. He accepts strict gender hierarchies, never imagining women in roles beyond household management and child rearing. His role ethics could simply reproduce existing social structures rather than enabling critique of unjust hierarchies. Modern Stoics attempting to appropriate his insights must either supplement them with critical principles or argue that his own framework implies rejection of unjust roles. The latter strategy notes that Stoic cosmopolitanism and the inherent value of all rational beings arguably contradicts hierarchies that deny full humanity to some people. If all humans share the divine spark of reason and belong to the cosmic city, what justifies enslaving some humans or denying women equal opportunity? Epictetus's failure to draw these conclusions might reflect cultural blindness rather than implications of his actual principles. This interpretive generosity has limits. We cannot simply read contemporary egalitarian commitments back into ancient texts that don't express them. But we can ask whether the deepest principles in a framework support extensions that the original thinker failed to recognize, bringing their ideas to fuller realization than they achieved. The emphasis on roles and relationships produces a distinctive picture of human flourishing and virtue. Virtue is not abstract adherence to principles, but excellent performance of your various roles. You are virtuous as a parent, as a citizen, as a friend, in context-specific ways that express general virtues through particular role-appropriate actions. This grounds ethics in actual human life rather than idealized abstractions. You don't ask what abstract reason commands, but what your particular roles in your specific circumstances demand. This makes ethics more concrete, but also more complex, resistant to simple, universalizable rules. It also makes ethics fundamentally social in ways that solitary conceptions of virtue miss. You cannot be fully virtuous in isolation, because many virtues require relationship contexts for their expression. Generosity requires others to give too. Justice requires social contexts of fair distribution. Courage often requires protection of others or standing up for community values. The Stoic wise person is not a solitary sage on a mountain, but a fully engaged member of community. Their wisdom expresses itself through relationships, through fulfilling diverse roles excellently, through contributing to collective human flourishing. Inner tranquility and freedom from passions serve outward engagement rather than replacing it. Part 7. Freedom, Emotions, and Apatheia. Freedom stands at the center of Epictetus's entire philosophical project. Yet his conception of freedom differs radically from modern political and psychological understandings. We typically think freedom means absence of external constraints. A free person can go where they choose, say what they think, pursue their goals without interference. Political freedom involves civil liberties, democratic participation, protection from arbitrary government power. Psychological freedom involves autonomy, self-determination, escape from internal compulsions. Epictetus claims that a person in chains can be completely free, while a wealthy emperor can be enslaved. This paradox dissolves when you grasp his technical definition of freedom. Freedom is the condition of prohairesis, operating according to its nature without impediment. Since prohairesis by nature cannot be compelled or obstructed by externals, it remains free regardless of external circumstances. You are enslaved when you stake your happiness on obtaining externals you don't control, because this gives those externals power over your well-being. You are free when your happiness depends only on your virtue, which remains entirely under your control. The slave who maintains virtue despite physical bondage is free in the only sense that ultimately matters. Their prohairesis operates correctly, desiring only what is good, avoiding only what is evil, accepting externals with equanimity. Physical chains constrain their body but cannot touch their rational faculty, their capacity for virtue, their genuine well-being. The emperor who craves flattery, fears assassination, desperately clings to power, is enslaved despite commanding legions. His happiness depends on maintaining power, which requires others' cooperation and fortune's favour, neither fully under his control. He has surrendered his freedom by making externals masters of his tranquility. This conception of freedom has inspired resistance movements and survival accounts across history. Viktor Frankl in concentration camps, Nelson Mandela in prison, and dissidents under totalitarian regimes all testified to inner freedom that circumstances could not destroy. They maintained dignity and moral agency, despite lacking any conventional freedom. Yet critics question whether this conception of freedom is adequate. Doesn't it risk becoming an opiate, consoling the oppressed with talk of inner freedom while leaving actual oppression unchallenged? If slaves are already free in the important sense, why work to abolish slavery? If political prisoners have inner freedom, why fight for their release? Epictetus would respond that inner freedom and pursuit of external freedom are not mutually exclusive. You should work to eliminate slavery and free political prisoners as part of your role as a just person and citizen. But you should not stake your own happiness on success in these efforts, because outcomes depend partly on factors outside your control. You maintain inner freedom while pursuing external freedom for yourself and others. The question remains whether the emphasis on inner freedom historically discouraged political resistance. Stoicism was popular among Roman elites precisely because it made their privilege seem justified by superior virtue. It also appealed to slaves and the powerless by offering consolation that didn't threaten existing hierarchies. Christianity later adopted this pattern, promising heavenly reward for earthly suffering while discouraging rebellion against unjust rulers. Whether this represents corruption of Epictetus's philosophy or its natural political implications depends on how you interpret his claims. The generous reading sees a sophisticated distinction between psychological well-being and political justice, both important but conceptually separate. The critical reading sees an ideology that stabilized oppressive systems by redirecting attention from structural injustice to individual virtue. Freedom from passions, what Stoics call apatheia, constitutes the emotional dimension of freedom. Passions are not emotions in general, but specific disturbances arising from false judgments about good and evil. Fear is the passion arising from judging some future external as genuinely evil and therefore threatening your happiness. You fear poverty, illness, death, disgrace, because you falsely believe these externals can truly harm you. Grief is the passion arising from judging some present or past external as genuinely evil that has already destroyed your happiness. Anger is the passion arising from judging that someone else's choice has genuinely harmed you and deserves punishment. All passions share a common structure: false value judgments about externals combined with the belief that your happiness depends on those externals. Remove the false judgment, and the passion dissolves. This analysis differs fundamentally from common modern views that emotions are non-cognitive feelings caused by events. You feel sad because something bad happened, afraid because you face danger, angry because someone wronged you. The emotions seem to arise automatically from situations, not from judgments you make about situations. But Epictetus argues that emotions incorporate evaluative beliefs that can be examined and revised. Your fear of death contains the belief that death is terrible for you. Your grief at loss contains the belief that the lost object was genuinely good for you. These beliefs are not separate from the emotion, but constitute it, giving it its specific character and intensity. Modern cognitive theories of emotion confirm this analysis in psychological and neuroscientific terms. Emotions are not pure feelings, but involve appraisal processes, evaluations of events relative to your goals and concerns. Different appraisals of the same event generate different emotions. Losing your job produces fear if you appraise it as threatening your security, relief if you appraise it as escape from a terrible situation. The appraisal happens rapidly, often unconsciously, in subcortical structures like the amygdala. But the appraisal still involves implicit evaluative content that can be made explicit and examined. When you fear losing your job, you implicitly judge that job loss threatens something important to you. Making this judgment explicit allows you to question whether it's accurate and proportionate. Clinical applications of cognitive models demonstrate that changing evaluative beliefs changes emotions. Cognitive therapy for anxiety systematically challenges catastrophic appraisals that generate excessive fear. The client learns that the feared outcome is less likely than they assume, less terrible than they imagine, more manageable than they believe. As these evaluative beliefs change, anxiety decreases even though the external situation remains the same. Epictetus prescribes achieving apatheia, freedom from passions, through systematic re-evaluation of externals. You recognize that wealth, health, reputation, and even life itself are preferred indifferents, not genuine goods. Losing them is losing something you rationally prefer, but not losing anything genuinely good. Therefore, losing them warrants disappointment, but not the passionate grief that treats them as necessary for happiness. Critics worry that apatheia eliminates motivation for action and concern for others. If you're indifferent to whether you have health or wealth, why work to obtain them? If you're indifferent to others' suffering, why help them? Doesn't apatheia produce a cold, withdrawn person concerned only with maintaining their own virtue? The Stoic response distinguishes apatheia from lack of concern entirely. The sage maintains rational preferences for health over illness, wealth over poverty, for themselves and others. They work energetically to obtain preferred outcomes and help others do the same, but they don't experience passionate attachment that makes their peace depend on success. Moreover, the sage experiences what Stoics call good emotions, eupatheiai, rational affective states appropriate to situations. They feel joy at virtue, their own and others, a positive emotion based on correct judgment of genuine good. They feel wish, rational desire for preferred indifference without desperate craving. They feel caution toward vice, appropriate concern about moral danger without irrational fear of externals. Whether good emotions are really emotions or just calm preferences remains debated. If joy at virtue feels nothing like ordinary joy, is it an emotion at all or just cognitive approval? If caution toward vice lacks the phenomenology of fear, has the sage eliminated fear or merely relabeled indifference? Epictetus doesn't fully address these questions because he focuses on eliminating destructive passions rather than articulating the positive emotional life of the sage. But his examples suggest that good emotions involve felt engagement with the world, not mere abstract cognition. The sage's joy at virtue is genuinely joyful, their concern for others genuinely caring, their caution genuinely vigilant. These emotions differ from passions by arising from correct rather than false judgments. Contemporary emotion research complicates this picture significantly. Emotions involve multiple components operating partly independently: physiological arousal, behavioral tendencies, subjective feelings, cognitive appraisals, and neural activations. You can change the cognitive component through reappraisal, while other components persist or change more slowly. Exposure therapy for phobias works partly by maintaining exposure until physiological arousal habituates, even though the cognitive appraisal has already changed. The body needs time to learn safety that the mind already recognizes. This suggests that achieving apatheia might be more complex than simply correcting judgments. You also need to retrain automatic physiological and behavioral responses through repeated exposure and practice. Cognitive change is necessary, but not always sufficient for emotional change. Epictetus recognizes this implicitly in his emphasis on habituation and repeated practice. You don't achieve virtue by understanding correct principles once, gap. You must practice applying them repeatedly until virtuous responses become automatic, until your immediate reactions align with right judgment. This is training the whole psychophysical system, not just the cognitive component. Modern trauma research reveals cases where Epictetus's approach has clear limits. Severe trauma can dysregulate the nervous system, creating persistent threat responses even when the person cognitively recognizes they're safe. PTSD involves intrusive memories, hypervigilance, and exaggerated startle responses that resist cognitive intervention alone. The amygdala remains hyperactive, the prefrontal regulation impaired, creating symptoms that feel involuntary and uncontrollable. Effective trauma treatment requires addressing this physiological dysregulation through techniques beyond cognitive restructuring. EMDR uses bilateral stimulation to facilitate memory processing. GAP. Somatic therapies work directly with body sensations to discharge trapped survival energy. Medication can modulate neurotransmitter systems that cognitive therapy cannot directly access. This doesn't invalidate Epictetus's approach, but reveals its scope limitations. For people with intact emotional regulation systems responding to ordinary life stresses, cognitive techniques can be remarkably effective. For people with severely dysregulated systems from extreme trauma, cognitive techniques need supplementation with other interventions targeting physiological components directly. The aspiration to apatheia also faces questions about whether it's humanly possible or even desirable. Can you really eliminate all fear of death, all grief at losing loved ones, all anger at injustice? Should you try to become someone who responds to tragedy with equanimity rather than anguish? Epictetus would say yes, this is both possible through sufficient training and desirable as the condition of complete freedom and happiness. But he admits that actually achieving it is rare, perhaps never perfectly realized. The ideal serves as a direction for development rather than a state most practitioners will reach. This creates tension between the theory's demands and its practical application. If perfect apatheia is impossible for all but rare sages, what guidance does the theory offer ordinary people struggling with real emotions? Should they feel guilty for experiencing grief, fear, and anger, seeing these as failures of virtue? Or should they accept imperfect progress while continuing to work toward the ideal? Modern therapeutic applications tend to emphasize progress over perfection, accepting that complete elimination of dysfunctional emotions is neither realistic nor necessary for substantial improvement. You don't need perfect freedom from anxiety to function well. GAP. You need sufficient reduction of excessive anxiety and sufficient increase in capacity to manage remaining anxiety. This more modest goal aligns with Epictetus's recognition that most students will not achieve complete virtue, but can still make meaningful progress. The goal is not immediate perfection, but sustained development in the right direction, becoming progressively freer from destructive passions. The relationship between freedom and attachment deserves careful examination. Epictetus seems to counsel avoiding deep attachment to anything external, including people you love. When you kiss your child goodnight, remind yourself that the child is mortal and could die tonight. This remembrance supposedly prevents excessive grief if death occurs because you never forgot mortality's reality. This advice horrifies many readers as emotionally cold and psychologically damaging. Shouldn't you love your child unreservedly, accepting the vulnerability that love involves? Doesn't real love require risking your happiness on another's well-being rather than maintaining safe emotional distance? Epictetus would respond that what we call love is often possessive attachment disguised as virtue. You treat the child as an extension of yourself, making their flourishing necessary for your happiness. This isn't genuine love for the child as a separate person with their own life and fate. It's using the child as a tool for your emotional needs, however unconsciously. Real love wishes the other's genuine good and accepts that you cannot guarantee it. You care deeply about your child's flourishing, but recognize that much about their life, including its length, lies outside your control. Accepting this doesn't mean loving less intensely, but loving more wisely, without the anxiety that makes your well-being hostage to theirs. Whether this is psychologically accurate or ethically adequate remains contested. Attachment theory in developmental psychology suggests that secure attachment, not detachment, produces healthy emotional development. Children need parents who are emotionally invested in them, whose happiness is genuinely bound up with theirs, to develop secure attachment patterns themselves. The Stoic might respond that secure attachment is compatible with recognizing mortality and accepting lack of ultimate control. You can be fully emotionally available to your child while remembering that you don't own them, that they will eventually leave or die, that their life is theirs, not yours, to control. Perhaps the dispute is more semantic than substantive, with both sides agreeing that love should combine deep care with recognition of separateness and mortality. The disagreement is how much emotional vulnerability this combination allows, and whether Stoic language about indifference captures what healthy love actually involves. Freedom ultimately means self-mastery, the capacity to govern yourself according to reason rather than being driven by passions. This is autonomy in the original Greek sense. Auto, self, and nomos, law, giving law to yourself. You are autonomous when you choose based on principles you endorse on reflection, rather than being pushed by impulses you haven't examined. You are free when nothing outside your rational faculty controls what you value and pursue. This connects to Kantian autonomy, the capacity to act according to self-given rational law rather than heteronymous determination by desire or social pressure. Kant argues that only autonomous action has moral worth because only then are you truly the author of your actions. But Kant's rationalism takes this further than Epictetus might accept. Kant thinks autonomy requires acting purely from duty, independent of all inclination and desire. Epictetus allows that you can autonomously pursue preferred indifference as long as you don't treat them as genuinely good. Acting to obtain wealth from rational preference while accepting you might fail is autonomous. Acting desperately to obtain wealth as if your happiness depended on it is not. Neuroscience locates the neural basis for self-mastery in prefrontal cortex and its connections with subcortical regions. The lateral prefrontal cortex maintains goals and rules, using them to evaluate options and guide behavior. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex integrates value information, enabling you to choose based on considered values rather than immediate impulses. The anterior cingulate cortex detects conflicts between automatic responses and intentions, signaling when self-control is needed. People with prefrontal damage show reduced self-mastery across domains: impulsivity, poor planning, inability to delay gratification, difficulty regulating emotions. They understand what they should do, but cannot consistently implement their understanding against competing impulses. This reveals that self-mastery depends on specific neural systems that can be damaged or impaired. This biological dependence creates another limit to Epictetus's claims about unconditional freedom. Your capacity for self-mastery depends on neural hardware that can malfunction. Gap. Severe prefrontal damage can eliminate prohairesis's capacity to function properly, rendering you unfree in precisely the sense Epictetus defines as the only freedom that matters. He might respond that we're discussing not a fully human being, but someone whose rational faculty has been destroyed by injury. The capacity for freedom belongs to humans by nature, but particular humans can lose it through brain damage, just as they can lose other natural capacities. This is tragic, but doesn't refute the claim that intact prohairesis is always free. Part 8. Critiques and Philosophical Challenges. Every major philosophical position generates serious objections, and Epictetus faces multiple lines of critique from ancient opponents to contemporary philosophers. The most fundamental challenge targets the dichotomy of control itself. Critics argue that it creates an untenable sharp division between what is and is not in our power. Consider again the example of raising your arm. The intention to raise it is internal, the physical movement external and potentially prevented by paralysis or restraints. But the intention itself depends on brain states caused by prior neural events, themselves caused by earlier states, in an unbroken causal chain extending back before your birth. If everything in the causal chain was determined by prior causes, in what sense was your intention up to you? You couldn't have intended differently given identical prior brain states and causes. The intention was necessitated by factors you didn't choose and couldn't control. Epictetus's compatibilism tries to answer this by defining freedom as acting from your own nature rather than being compelled by external force. But the critic responds that your nature itself was determined by causes you didn't choose: genetics, early environment, random neural noise. You didn't choose to be someone who values honesty or craves approval or fears failure. These features of your character cause your intentions and choices, but you didn't choose them. The incompatibilist argues that genuine responsibility requires ultimate origination, that your choices must not be completely determined by prior causes outside your control. Gap. Without this, you're just a sophisticated mechanism, your sense of choice an illusion. Modern debates between compatibilists and libertarians remain unresolved. Compatibilists argue that libertarian free will is incoherent, requiring uncaused choices that would be random rather than free. Libertarians argue that compatibilist freedom is too weak, compatible with deterministic systems that intuitively lack real agency. Epictetus never fully engages this deep problem because he assumes compatibilism without defending it against sophisticated objections. His practical philosophy works only if compatibilism is correct, if determined choices from your rational nature count as genuinely yours. Gap. If incompatibilism is correct, his entire system might rest on an illusion. A related critique challenges the claim that prohairesis is completely invulnerable to external influence. Modern psychology demonstrates that external factors shape our judgments and choices far more than we consciously recognize. Priming studies show that exposure to words or images influences subsequent behavior without awareness. People walk more slowly after reading words associated with elderly stereotypes. Gap. They act more competitively after viewing images of businessmen. They judge ambiguous targets more negatively after exposure to negative primes. Social influence shapes our beliefs and values through mechanisms we don't notice or control. We unconsciously adopt the attitudes of our peer groups. Gap. We conform to majority opinions even when we know they're wrong. We accept authority figures' claims with insufficient scrutiny. Implicit biases affect our judgments and actions independently of our explicit values and intentions. People who sincerely reject racism still show automatic negative associations with racial outgroups on implicit measures. These associations predict discriminatory behavior in subtle ways that explicit attitudes don't capture. All this suggests that prohairesis is not the autonomous rational faculty Epictetus describes, but a process heavily influenced by factors outside conscious awareness and control. Your judgments about what to value and pursue are shaped by marketing, social pressure, cultural narratives and unconscious biases you never chose and may not even recognize. Epictetus would likely respond that these influences affect you only to the extent you fail to examine impressions carefully and assent to them critically. The person who accepts primed impressions without scrutiny has failed to use their prohairesis properly. Gap. Through philosophical training, you can become aware of these influences and resist them through conscious evaluation. But the empirical evidence suggests that even philosophically trained people remain vulnerable to these influences. Philosophers show the same biases as non-philosophers in experimental studies. Gap. Expert ethicists behave no more ethically than other professors in their daily lives. Knowing about biases doesn't eliminate them. This doesn't refute Stoicism completely, but suggests that achieving the control Epictetus promises is far harder than he acknowledges. You might have some capacity to examine and resist external influences through effortful conscious processing, gap, but you can never fully escape them or catch every influence judgment before it shapes your choices. The value theory underlying Stoic ethics faces serious objections. The claim that only virtue is genuinely good, while health, wealth and relationships are merely preferred indifference, strikes most people as absurd. Consider two lives identical in virtue, but different in externals. One person lives healthy, surrounded by loving family, pursuing meaningful work, contributing to their community. Gap. The other lives in chronic pain, isolated, unable to pursue their goals due to poverty and oppression. Stoicism maintains these lives are equally good because they share the only thing that matters, virtue. But this seems to deny obvious facts about what makes lives go well or badly. Gap. The second life is clearly worse, even if the person maintains admirable virtue throughout their suffering. Critics argue that welfare depends on more than virtue alone. It includes pleasure and pain, accomplishment of goals, loving relationships, autonomy to shape your life, and other elements genuinely good for people. Gap. A theory that denies this doesn't capture what well-being actually involves. The Stoic might respond that we confuse happiness with pleasure or preference satisfaction. True happiness is eudaimonia, flourishing as the distinctive kind of being you are. Gap. For rational beings, flourishing consists fundamentally in excellent rational activity, which is virtue. Externals can make life more pleasant, but cannot make it more genuinely flourishing in the eudaimonistic sense. But critics find this stipulative redefinition of happiness unconvincing. If your notion of flourishing renders suffering irrelevant, you've defined flourishing incorrectly. Gap. Any adequate account of human well-being must make room for the genuine badness of pain, isolation, and frustrated agency. The problem intensifies when considering severe suffering. Can torture victims really maintain happiness through virtue alone? Gap. Can people in chronic severe pain flourish if they just maintain correct judgments about value? Epictetus never seriously confronts these hard cases. His students were generally privileged Romans, not people suffering extreme deprivation or torture. Gap. The examples he discusses involve manageable hardships like insults, financial losses, and difficult family members, not catastrophic suffering that destroys the capacity for rational choice itself. Modern experience with severe trauma, torture, and psychological breakdown reveals limits to what attitude change alone can accomplish. Some suffering genuinely is terrible, not just mistakenly judged terrible. Gap. Some external conditions are so bad they prevent flourishing, no matter how virtuous your response. Acknowledging this doesn't mean accepting that happiness depends entirely on externals, but it requires a more nuanced position than Epictetus provides. The role ethics faces objections about its conservative political implications. By emphasizing acceptance of assigned roles and maintaining virtue within existing social structures, Stoicism can function as an ideology supporting unjust hierarchies. Epictetus tells slaves to fulfill their role excellently, performing their duties regardless of how masters treat them. He tells women to fulfill their domestic roles, never questioning whether these roles should exist or be assigned by gender. Gap. The philosophy provides comfort to the oppressed, but doesn't challenge oppression itself. Defenders respond that Epictetus's cosmopolitanism and emphasis on human dignity contain seeds of egalitarianism that he failed to develop fully. All humans share divine reason and belong to the cosmic city as equals. Gap. This principle, taken seriously, undermines justifications for slavery, patriarchy, and other hierarchies that deny full humanity to some people. But this defence requires reading against the text's surface, meaning and imputing to Epictetus conclusions he never drew. We cannot know whether he would have endorsed these egalitarian extensions if challenged or rejected them as misunderstanding his actual position. What we can say is that his philosophy, as practiced historically, often served conservative functions, reconciling people to unjust conditions rather than inspiring resistance. Whether this represents corruption of his true intentions or their natural political expression remains contested. Epictetus's treatment of emotions and grief particularly troubles many readers. The advice to remind yourself of mortality when kissing your child goodnight seems psychologically harmful and ethically wrong. Normal grief at losing loved ones is not a moral failing that superior philosophy would eliminate. It's an appropriate response to genuine loss, part of what loving relationships involve. Gap. A parent who feels no grief at their child's death hasn't achieved virtue, but has something deeply wrong with them psychologically. The Stoic response that proper understanding prevents grief because you never mistakenly thought the person necessary for your happiness mischaracterizes healthy attachment. Loving someone does make them necessary for certain kinds of happiness, namely the happiness that comes from relationship with that particular person. Gap. Losing them is genuinely losing something good, not just mistakenly thinking you've lost something good. Contemporary grief researchers confirm that healthy grieving involves acknowledging the reality and painfulness of loss, not philosophically transcending it through detachment. Avoiding grief through emotional distance creates problems rather than solving them. Gap. The inability to grieve, whether from philosophical training or psychological damage, indicates impaired emotional functioning. Epictetus might respond that he's describing the ideal sage, not prescribing that ordinary people should feel no grief. The sage's equanimity at loss reflects perfect understanding achieved through decades of training, not something beginners should expect or force. Gap. But this concession weakens the practical applicability of his advice while raising questions about whether the ideal is even coherent. The emphasis on self-sufficiency and invulnerability has problematic gender implications that feminist critics have identified. The ideal Stoic sage is self-contained, needing nothing external, completely autonomous, and invulnerable to harm. Gap. This is a traditionally masculine ideal that devalues care, vulnerability, and interdependence associated with women and feminine virtues. Feminist care ethics argues that humans are fundamentally interdependent, that our flourishing inherently involves relational connection requiring vulnerability. The fantasy of complete self-sufficiency denies our actual condition as beings who need care, give care, and are constituted through relationships. Rather than aiming for invulnerability, we should embrace appropriate vulnerability as part of genuine human connection. Real strength includes admitting need, accepting help, allowing others to matter to us enough that their well-being affects ours. Gap. The Stoic ideal, pushed to its extreme, produces isolated individuals who protect themselves through emotional withdrawal rather than risking the vulnerability that deep connection requires. The Stoic might respond that this caricatures their position, that they value relationships and community while simply maintaining that your happiness shouldn't be hostage to what you can't control. But the feminist critic questions whether you can have genuine intimate relationships while maintaining the emotional independence Stoicism prescribes. The practical applicability of Stoic training faces questions about efficacy and accessibility. Does philosophical therapy actually work as well as Epictetus claims? Gap. Can ordinary people achieve the transformation he describes through the practices he prescribes? Modern psychotherapy research provides mixed evidence. Cognitive behavioral therapy, which adapts Stoic techniques, shows strong efficacy for anxiety and depression in clinical trials. Gap. Effect sizes are substantial, outcomes comparable to or better than medication for many conditions. This validates the basic insight that changing evaluative beliefs can change emotions and behavior. But therapy success rates are far from universal, with significant numbers of people not responding to treatment. Even successful treatment rarely produces the complete transformation of character and elimination of passions that Epictetus describes. Gap. People improve significantly but don't become sages free from all emotional disturbance. Moreover, therapy requires extensive professional support unavailable to most people historically and many people currently. Epictetus envisions students working with teachers in intensive philosophical communities over years. Gap. Few people can access such support, raising questions about how ordinary individuals practicing alone can achieve real progress. Recent attempts to make Stoicism accessible through books, apps, and online communities test whether philosophical self-help can work without intensive professional guidance. Early results are mixed, with some people reporting significant benefits, but others finding the practices too difficult or abstract to implement consistently. Gap. This suggests that while Stoic insights have genuine value, translating them into effective practice remains challenging. Finally, the entire framework rests on problematic metaphysical assumptions that modern science undermines. The Stoic cosmos is rationally ordered by divine providence, with everything happening for good reasons according to Zeus's plan. Gap. Modern physics reveals a universe that operates according to natural laws with no evidence of purposive design or cosmic intelligence. Evolution explains biological complexity through natural selection without invoking intelligent design. Suffering exists because selection favored organisms that feel pain as a warning system, not because Zeus arranged it for our moral development. Gap. Events happen through causal processes indifferent to human well-being, not according to a benevolent rational plan. This doesn't directly refute Stoic ethics, which could potentially be separated from Stoic physics. You might accept the practical techniques for managing emotions and developing virtue while rejecting the metaphysical framework. Gap. This is essentially what cognitive behavioral therapy does, keeping the psychological insights while abandoning divine providence. But something important is lost in this separation. For Epictetus, ethics rests on understanding your place in the cosmic order and aligning yourself with Zeus's will. Gap. Without the metaphysical foundation, ethical claims become more arbitrary, lacking the grounding that the systematic Stoic worldview provided. You're left with practical techniques that seem to work but lack the philosophical unity that made Stoicism a comprehensive worldview rather than just applied psychology. Part 9. Modern Applications and Scientific Validation. Epictetus's influence on contemporary psychotherapy represents one of history's most remarkable examples of ancient philosophy directly shaping modern clinical practice. Albert Ellis, founder of rational emotive behavior therapy, explicitly credited Epictetus as his primary philosophical inspiration. Ellis built REBT directly on the principle that people disturb themselves not by events, but by their beliefs about events. Gap. He recognized this as essentially identical to Epictetus's claim that impressions themselves are neutral, but assenting to false evaluative judgments creates disturbance. Ellis frequently quoted Epictetus in his clinical work and theoretical writings. He described the Enchiridion as a handbook for psychotherapy written 2,000 years before modern therapy existed. Gap, REBT's core technique, disputing irrational beliefs, directly parallels the Stoic practice of examining impressions before granting assent. Aaron Beck, founder of cognitive therapy, similarly acknowledged Stoic philosophy as an important precursor. Beck identified automatic thoughts as a key mechanism in depression and anxiety, thoughts that arise reflexively and are accepted without examination. Gap. These are precisely what Epictetus calls impressions, mental events that appear in consciousness uninvited. Beck's therapeutic method teaches clients to identify automatic thoughts, evaluate them against evidence, and develop more accurate alternative thoughts. This is the correct use of impressions, the practice of pausing between impression and assent to examine whether the impression's claims are true. Gap. The therapeutic techniques map almost perfectly onto Epictetus's prescriptions, though Beck arrived at them through clinical observation rather than reading ancient texts. Modern CBT represents the most empirically validated psychotherapy approach across multiple conditions. Meta-analyses of hundreds of randomized controlled trials show CBT produces significant symptom reduction for anxiety disorders, depression, PTSD, OCD, eating disorders, and insomnia. Gap. Effect sizes typically range from medium to large, outcomes often maintained at follow-up periods of 6 months to 2 years. These results validate Epictetus's core insight that changing evaluative beliefs can change emotions and reduce psychological suffering. You can learn to examine thoughts rather than automatically accepting them, to test beliefs against evidence, to separate facts from interpretations. Gap. This learnable skill reduces symptoms across diverse clinical presentations, exactly as Epictetus claimed philosophical training would. However, CBT doesn't work equally well for everyone or every condition. Response rates in clinical trials typically range from 50 to 70%, meaning 30 to 50% don't achieve clinically significant improvement. Gap. Even responders rarely achieve complete symptom elimination, instead showing meaningful but incomplete reduction. These limitations suggest Epictetus may have overstated how completely philosophical training can eliminate emotional disturbance. The neural mechanisms underlying CBT's effectiveness reveal how cognitive change affects brain function. Studies using fMRI before and after CBT treatment show changes in brain activation patterns corresponding to symptom improvement. For anxiety disorders, CBT reduces amygdala hyperreactivity to threat stimuli. The amygdala's exaggerated response to potentially dangerous stimuli normalizes as patients learn that feared outcomes are less likely and less terrible than they assumed. Gap. This demonstrates that cognitive change produces measurable changes in emotional processing at the neural level. CBT also increases prefrontal cortex activation during emotion regulation tasks. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex shows stronger activation when patients reappraise emotional stimuli after treatment compared to before. Gap. This suggests that CBT strengthens the neural circuits involved in cognitive control of emotion, essentially training the biological substrate of prohairesis. For depression, CBT normalizes connectivity between prefrontal regions and limbic structures. Depressed patients show altered connectivity in networks involved in self-referential processing and emotion regulation. Gap. Successful CBT restores more typical connectivity patterns corresponding to reduced negative self-focus and improved mood regulation. These neuroimaging findings validate Epictetus's claim that philosophical training reshapes how you process impressions and regulate emotions. The training literally changes brain function in measurable ways, strengthening circuits that enable cognitive control while reducing automatic emotional reactivity. Mindfulness-based interventions represent another modern therapeutic approach with Stoic elements. Mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, and acceptance and commitment therapy all emphasize observing mental events without immediately reacting to them. This core mindfulness practice closely parallels Epictetus's instruction to externalize impressions, treating them as objects to observe rather than transparent windows on reality. When you notice a thought arising and recognize it as just a thought rather than fact, you create the psychological distance necessary for prohairesis to function. Research on mindfulness meditation shows it produces changes in brain structure and function. Regular meditators have increased grey matter density in regions associated with attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness, including prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and insular gap. They show reduced amygdala volume and reactivity, corresponding to decreased stress reactivity and emotional volatility. Mindfulness training improves performance on attention tasks, reduces mind wandering, and enhances working memory capacity. These cognitive improvements support better emotion regulation by strengthening the capacity to maintain focus on chosen objects rather than being captured by ruminative thoughts. Gap. This is precisely what Epictetus describes as training attention to remain with appropriate impressions rather than being pulled into passionate reactions. The dichotomy of control has found application in performance psychology and resilience training. Athletes, military personnel, and business leaders are taught to focus effort on what they control while accepting what lies outside their control. Sports psychology emphasizes process goals, focusing on your preparation and performance rather than outcomes, depending partly on opponents and luck. You control your training regimen, your strategic choices, your mental state during competition. Gap. You don't control whether you win, because that depends also on how competitors perform. Focusing on controllable process rather than uncontrollable outcome reduces performance anxiety and improves consistency. Military resilience training teaches soldiers to distinguish between controllable and uncontrollable aspects of combat situations. You cannot control whether you face combat, what enemies do, or whether you're injured. Gap. You can control your training, your response to stress, your decision-making under pressure, and your efforts to help teammates. This framework helps soldiers maintain effectiveness despite facing uncontrollable danger. Research on locus of control validates this approach. People with internal locus of control, believing their actions significantly influence outcomes, show better mental health and performance across domains. Gap. They experience less depression and anxiety, achieve higher grades in school, show better job performance, and cope more effectively with stress. Teaching people to focus on controllable factors strengthens internal locus of control and produces these beneficial outcomes. The concept of preferred indifference helps address paradoxes in modern decision theory and behavioral economics. People often violate rational choice theory by caring about processes and comparisons rather than just absolute outcomes. You might prefer earning $60,000 to $50,000, but feel worse about earning $60,000 when your peer earns $70,000 than earning $50,000 when your peer earns $40,000. This violates standard economic rationality, because $60,000 gives you more resources than $50,000, regardless of what others earn. Gap. But it makes sense if you value positional goods, your standing relative to others, not just absolute consumption. Epictetus's framework explains this by distinguishing what you rationally prefer from what you treat as genuinely good. You can rationally prefer more money to less, while recognizing that money is not genuinely good, not necessary for happiness. Gap. When you mistakenly treat money as genuinely good, you become vulnerable to unhappiness from comparisons, even when your absolute situation is objectively better. Understanding that money is merely a preferred indifferent protects against this irrationality. Research on hedonic adaptation demonstrates that treating preferred indifference as genuinely good produces disappointment. Obtaining desired outcomes like wealth, status, or possessions provides temporary satisfaction that rapidly fades as you adapt to new circumstances and reset aspirations higher. Gap. This creates a hedonic treadmill where you pursue ever-increasing goals but never achieve lasting satisfaction. Recognizing that these goods are indifferent to happiness can break the cycle by preventing the false belief that obtaining them will make you happy. The study of virtue and character strengths in positive psychology shows connections to Stoic ethics. Christopher Peterson and Martin Seligman's character strengths classification identifies 24 character strengths grouped under 6 core virtues: wisdom, courage, humanity, justice, temperance, and transcendence. These overlap substantially with Stoic virtues, though the classification includes some strengths like humour and appreciation of beauty that Stoics didn't emphasize. Research shows that people high in character strengths report greater life satisfaction, meaning and flourishing. Gap. They experience more positive emotions, better relationships, and greater resilience to adversity. Interventions designed to cultivate character strengths produce measurable improvements in well-being. Using your signature strengths in new ways each day increases happiness and decreases depression for months after the intervention period. Gap. This validates the Stoic claim that developing virtue, exercising your rational capacities excellently, is genuinely good for you, independent of external circumstances. Epictetus's role ethics has influenced organizational behavior research on role clarity and work meaning. Workers who clearly understand their roles and how those roles contribute to larger organizational purposes report higher job satisfaction and performance. Gap. Role ambiguity creates stress and reduces effectiveness, while role clarity facilitates coordination and provides meaning. Research on calling and vocation shows that people who see their work as a calling rather than just a job or career report greater satisfaction and engagement. A calling involves understanding your work as fulfilling your purpose, contributing to something larger than personal advancement. Gap. This is essentially Epictetus's concept of recognizing and fulfilling the role Zeus has assigned you. The concept of psychological flexibility from acceptance and commitment therapy directly parallels Stoic acceptance of externals. Psychological flexibility involves accepting difficult thoughts and emotions without struggle, while choosing actions aligned with your values. Gap. You don't try to eliminate uncomfortable feelings, but make room for them while pursuing what matters to you. This is accepting externals with equanimity while focusing effort on what you control. Pain and difficult emotions are like external events. They arise based on circumstances you don't fully control. Gap. Fighting against them wastes energy and creates additional suffering. Accepting them while still choosing value-aligned action is precisely what Epictetus prescribes. Research shows that psychological flexibility predicts better mental health, greater life satisfaction, and more effective behavior change. People high in psychological flexibility show less anxiety and depression, maintain closer relationships, and achieve their goals more successfully. Gap. Teaching psychological flexibility through ACT produces clinically significant improvements comparable to traditional CBT. The application of Stoic principles to pain management demonstrates practical value. Chronic pain patients who catastrophize about pain, treating it as unbearable and their life as ruined by it, suffer far more than patients with similar objective pain levels who accept pain without catastrophizing. Gap. The pain itself is partly external, determined by tissue damage and nervous system sensitivity you don't fully control. Your evaluation of pain as terrible and life-destroying is internal, under your control through prohoresis. Cognitive behavioral therapy for chronic pain teaches acceptance of pain while challenging catastrophic interpretations. Pain is real and unpleasant, but doesn't make your life worthless or prevent all valued activity. Gap. You can experience pain while still pursuing relationships, meaningful work, and personal development. This reframing, changing your judgment about what pain means, significantly reduces suffering and improves functioning even when objective pain levels remain unchanged. Epictetus's techniques for morning preparation and evening review have been adapted into modern behavioral interventions. Implementation intentions, planning exactly when and how you'll perform desired behaviors significantly increase follow-through rates. Gap. This is the Stoic practice of premeditating difficulties and preparing responses in advance. If-then plans specify both trigger situations and planned responses. If X situation occurs, then I will do Y response. Gap. These plans automate good choices by establishing conditional commitments that activate when relevant situations arise. This is exactly what Epictetus prescribes. Preparing in advance how you'll handle predictable challenges so your response is ready when they occur. Self-monitoring through journaling improves awareness and facilitates behavior change across domains from diet to exercise to emotional regulation. Recording your experiences makes patterns visible that would otherwise remain implicit. Gap. This is the Stoic Evening Review, examining the day's events to learn from successes and failures. Research confirms that daily self-monitoring enhances goal pursuit. People who track their behavior toward goals achieve better outcomes than those who don't, with the effect mediated by increased awareness and accountability. Gap. The Stoic Evening Review builds this practice into a comprehensive system for moral development. The modern effectiveness of Stoic-derived techniques provides strong empirical validation for Epictetus's core psychological insights. He correctly identified that evaluative beliefs mediate emotional responses, that these beliefs can be examined and revised, that such revision reduces suffering and improves functioning. Gap. He recognized that training attention and developing habits of response through practice reshapes character over time. He understood that focusing on what you control while accepting what you don't reduces anxiety and increases effectiveness. These insights were remarkable, given the absence of controlled studies, neuroscience, or modern psychology. Epictetus arrived at them through careful observation of human experience and rigorous philosophical analysis. Gap. That they survive empirical testing 2,000 years later testifies to the power of philosophical investigation as a method for understanding human nature. However, modern research also reveals limitations in Epictetus's approach. Complete elimination of emotional disturbance appears impossible for most people, not just difficult. Gap. Some suffering results from biological dysregulation that cognitive techniques alone cannot address. The techniques work better for some people and some conditions than others, not universally as claimed. Gap. And the metaphysical framework supporting the ethics doesn't survive scientific scrutiny, even if the practical techniques remain valuable. Part 10. Legacy, Influence, and Misconceptions. Epictetus's ideas have travelled through 20 centuries, shaping emperors and slaves, inspiring revolutionaries and mystics, grounding psychotherapy and corporate training. Few philosophers have influenced so many people across such diverse contexts. Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor from 161 to 180 CE, was never Epictetus's direct student, but studied his works intensively. The Meditations, Marcus's private philosophical journal, contains extensive Stoic reflection clearly influenced by Epictetus's teachings. Gap. Marcus quotes or paraphrases Epictetus repeatedly, applying his principles to the challenges of ruling an empire and maintaining virtue amid temptation and pressure. The spectacle of the world's most powerful man practicing Stoic self-examination reveals the philosophy's broad appeal. Marcus had unlimited power, but used Stoic techniques to maintain humility, remind himself that reputation is external, treat others justly despite having authority to do otherwise. Gap. Whether he succeeded in fully applying Stoic principles while waging wars and persecuting Christians remains debatable. But his attempt to integrate philosophy with political power created an enduring model of the philosopher-ruler. Early Christianity absorbed Stoic ideas extensively, particularly from Epictetus. The emphasis on inner freedom, independent of external circumstances, appealed to Christians facing persecution. Gap. The cosmopolitan view of all humans as children of God aligned with Christian universalism. The discipline of examining thoughts and maintaining virtue through trials paralleled Christian spiritual practices. However, Christian theologians eventually rejected crucial Stoic doctrines. Epictetus's pantheism, identifying God with nature and the cosmos itself, conflicted with Christian theism, positing a transcendent creator distinct from creation. Gap. The Stoic belief in human self-sufficiency through reason alone contradicted Christian emphasis on human sinfulness and need for divine grace. The calm acceptance of fate seemed incompatible with active charity towards suffering neighbours. Augustine admired Stoic moral rigour, but argued it represented human pride, the attempt to achieve perfection through your own efforts rather than accepting dependence on God's grace. Gap. Pascal similarly praised Epictetus as a great moralist, but criticized the arrogance of believing humans could perfect themselves without divine help. This Christian critique of Stoic self-sufficiency remains influential, shaping how religious readers interpret Epictetus. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought Epictetus back to prominence in European intellectual life. Angelo Politiano translated the Enchiridion into Latin in 1497, making it accessible to educated Europeans. Gap. Vernacular translations soon followed, with Epictetus becoming required reading for educated gentlemen. Neo-Stoicism, a movement blending Stoic philosophy with Christian theology, flourished in the 16th and 17th centuries. Justus Lipsius, Guillaume du Vair, and Thomas Gattaca argued that Stoic ethics were compatible with Christianity if you replaced Zeus with the Christian God and added grace to human reason. Gap. They saw Stoicism as practical wisdom for navigating political instability and religious war, providing inner stability amid external chaos. Descartes, despite his revolutionary philosophy, adopted recognizably Epictetan ethics in his personal life. He advised focusing on changing yourself rather than the world, desiring only what lies within your power, accepting fortune's reversals with equanimity. Gap. This sits oddly with his systematic doubt and rationalist metaphysics, but reveals Stoicism's practical appeal even to philosophers who rejected its theoretical foundations. The Enlightenment's relationship to Epictetus was complex and conflicted. Voltaire admired Stoic ethics and included Epictetus among the wise moralists worth reading. Gap. The emphasis on reason over superstition aligned with Enlightenment values, as did the cosmopolitan humanitarianism. But Enlightenment progressives criticized Stoic acceptance of fate and existing social orders. If you accept everything as Zeus's wise arrangement, you won't work to reform unjust institutions. Gap. The philosophy seemed conservative, justifying acquiescence to tyranny and inequality rather than inspiring revolutionary change. Diderot and de Holbach saw Stoicism as an opiate distracting from urgent political struggles. This tension between Stoicism as a resource for resistance versus as an ideology supporting oppression runs throughout its reception history. Slaves and prisoners found it empowering, claiming inner freedom rulers couldn't touch. Gap. Rulers and privileged classes found it stabilizing, encouraging subjects to accept their station rather than rebel. The same ideas could serve liberation or domination, depending on who wielded them and how. 19th-century appropriations of Epictetus were diverse and often superficial. Self-help literature adopted Stoic slogans without philosophical depth, reducing complex arguments to platitudes about positive thinking. Gap. The distinction between preferred indifference and genuine goods disappeared, replaced by simple advice to focus on what you control and accept what you cannot change. This popularization made Stoic ideas widely accessible, but stripped them of theoretical sophistication. The connection to Stoic physics and the systematic unity of logic, physics, and ethics was lost. Gap. What remained was practical advice, detached from its grounding, effective perhaps, but philosophically shallow. This pattern continues in contemporary self-help appropriations of Stoicism. Nietzsche's relationship to Stoicism was hostile and revealing. He attacked Stoic claims to live according to nature as self-deceptive, arguing that Stoics actually projected their values onto nature, then claimed to be following it. Gap. Nature is amoral, indifferent to human values, neither rational nor purposive. Stoics who claimed to follow nature were really following their own wills while pretending to submit to cosmic order. Nietzsche also rejected Stoic apatheia as life-denying, a cowardly withdrawal from existence's passionate intensity. The will to power requires embracing strong emotions, including destructive ones, not achieving tranquility through detachment. Gap. Stoic virtue represented weakness disguised as strength, fear of life disguised as wisdom. Whether these criticisms hit Epictetus specifically is questionable. Nietzsche engaged primarily with Roman Stoicism's popular versions, possibly misunderstanding the sophisticated philosophy behind the slogans. Gap. But his critique influenced 20th-century continental philosophy's dismissal of Stoicism as representing bad faith and self-deception. 20th-century academic philosophy largely ignored Epictetus until the late 1900s. Analytic philosophers found ancient ethics insufficiently rigorous and too focused on practical advice rather than conceptual analysis. Gap. Continental philosophers saw Stoicism as representing the problematic Hellenistic turn away from genuine philosophical radicalism. The revival began with specialized scholarship on Stoic philosophy and increased interest in virtue ethics as an alternative to consequentialism and deontology. A. Long's Epictetus, a Stoic and Socratic guide to life, in 2002 marked a turning point, presenting Epictetus as a serious philosopher worthy of sustained analysis rather than just historical curiosity. Gap. Subsequent scholarship has produced detailed studies of prohairesis, role ethics, and Epictetus's relationship to earlier Stoic tradition. Popular interest in Stoicism has surged in the 21st century, driven partly by online communities and partly by applications to modern challenges. The Modern Stoicism organization runs annual Stoic Week events where thousands practice Stoic exercises and report outcomes. Gap. Initial studies suggest participants report reduced negative emotions and increased life satisfaction, though the research lacks rigorous controls. Ryan Holiday's books have introduced millions to Stoic ideas through accessible modern writing, blending ancient wisdom with contemporary examples. The obstacle is the way applies Stoic principles to overcoming challenges, emphasizing that how you respond to obstacles matters more than the obstacles themselves. Gap. While valuable for popularization, these works sometimes simplify complex philosophy into self-help slogans that lose theoretical depth. Common misconceptions about Epictetus and Stoicism persist despite scholarly correction. The most prevalent is that Stoics are emotionless, suppressing all feelings to maintain cold detachment from life. Gap. This misreads apatheia as apathy, missing the distinction between destructive passions based on false judgments and appropriate rational emotions based on correct judgments. Stoics don't eliminate all emotion, but transform emotions by transforming underlying beliefs. The sage feels joy at virtue, rational desire for preferred indifference, appropriate concern for others' well-being. Gap. They don't feel fear of external events treated as genuinely harmful, or grief-treating losses as destroying happiness. This is sophisticated emotional regulation, not emotional suppression or numbness. Another misconception is that Stoicism counsels passive acceptance of injustice and suffering. The confusion arises from the emphasis on accepting what lies outside your control, which seems to imply accepting everything, including changeable injustices. Gap. But Stoic acceptance applies to what has already occurred, not to what you should pursue going forward. You accept that some event happened while working energetically to prevent similar events in the future. Moreover, Stoic roles generate duties to oppose injustice, help others, contribute to community well-being. Your role as a human being and citizen requires working for justice even when you can't guarantee success. Gap. The philosophy combines acceptance of what you don't control with vigorous effort to improve what you do influence. A related misunderstanding treats the dichotomy of control as advocating withdrawal from the world. If external outcomes don't matter, why engage with them at all? Gap. Why pursue career success, political change, or social relationships when they're ultimately indifferent? The answer is that indifferent doesn't mean unimportant or not worth pursuing. Preferred indifference like health and meaningful work are rationally worth pursuing, even though they're not necessary for happiness. Gap. You engage fully with the world while maintaining equanimity about outcomes, pursuing excellence in your roles without tying your well-being to success. This is engaged action with psychological freedom, not withdrawal into isolation. Some critics misread Epictetus as advocating individual self-interest at the expense of social concern. The focus on your own virtue and inner state seems narcissistic, obsessed with personal tranquility while ignoring others' suffering. Gap. But Stoic cosmopolitanism and role ethics directly contradict this reading. You have duties to others flowing from your nature as a social being, and fulfilling these duties excellently is central to virtue. Gap. Concern for yourself and concern for others are not competing, but complementary, both essential to flourishing. The relationship between ancient Stoicism and modern appropriations raises authenticity questions. Cognitive behavioral therapy keeps Stoic psychological techniques while abandoning metaphysical commitments to divine providence and cosmic rationality. Gap. Is this a legitimate development of Stoic insights, or a distortion that loses what made Stoicism coherent? One view holds that Stoicism must be taken as a unified system or not at all. The ethics depends on the physics, the practical techniques on the theoretical framework. Gap. Stripping away the metaphysics leaves only isolated practical tips without proper grounding, self-help rather than philosophy. This approach prioritizes historical fidelity and systematic coherence over contemporary applicability. The alternative view sees Stoic insights as separable from their ancient framework and applicable with different foundations. The psychological observations about how beliefs mediate emotions remain valid whether or not Zeus designed the cosmos. Gap. The practical techniques work whether or not you believe in fate and providence. Modern secular Stoicism represents legitimate development, adapting ancient wisdom to contemporary understanding rather than betraying it. Epictetus himself provides little guidance for resolving this dispute. He lived in a world where divine providence was widely accepted, making questions about secular alternatives unimaginable to him. Gap. We cannot know whether he would approve modern adaptations or insist that his philosophy requires its full metaphysical framework. Contemporary Stoics must make this interpretive choice for themselves based on what they find philosophically defensible and practically valuable. The feminist critique of Stoicism as embodying problematic masculine values requires careful engagement. The ideal of self-sufficiency and invulnerability does align with traditional masculine ideals in ways that may devalue feminine virtues of care and relationality. Gap. If pushed to an extreme, Stoic autonomy could justify emotional withdrawal and refusal of vulnerability necessary for genuine intimacy. But defenders argue that Epictetus's actual philosophy is more nuanced. He emphasizes natural affection, fulfillment of caring roles, and participation in community. Gap. The wise person is not isolated but deeply connected, expressing virtue through relationships rather than despite them. The critique may target caricatured versions of Stoicism rather than Epictetus's careful formulations. The resolution likely requires synthesis. Stoicism can contribute insights about cognitive regulation and maintaining integrity under pressure, while feminism provides needed correction about relationality and appropriate vulnerability. Gap. Neither perspective captures the full truth alone, but together they might articulate a more complete account of human flourishing. The question of whether Epictetus's philosophy can ground comprehensive life, meaning in a secular age, remains open. Many people seek philosophical frameworks that provide existential orientation, not just coping techniques for stress. Gap. They want to understand their place in the cosmos, their purpose, the ultimate nature of reality. Stoic cosmology provided these things for ancient practitioners. You were a fragment of Zeus, part of the cosmic rational order, with a role in the divine plan. Gap. This gave profound meaning to existence, independent of conventional success or pleasure. Fulfilling your role excellently participated in cosmic purpose larger than your individual life. Modern secular worldviews struggle to provide equivalent meaning. You're a product of evolution on one planet in an indifferent universe, your existence a cosmic accident, your purposes self-created rather than divinely assigned. Gap. This can feel liberating, giving you freedom to define your own meaning, or terrifying, making all meaning seem arbitrary and ultimately empty. Epictetus cannot directly address this modern predicament because he never imagined a world without cosmic meaning. But his emphasis on virtue as the only genuine good might survive the transition. Gap. Even in an indifferent universe, excellence of character has value. relationships matter, and contribution to human flourishing provides purpose. Whether this suffices for deep existential meaning or leaves a void only religious or metaphysical commitments can fill remains a personal question each person must answer. Part 11. Integration and Enduring Relevance. 20 centuries after a nameless slave studied philosophy in Rome, his ideas permeate contemporary culture in ways both visible and hidden. Understanding what makes Epictetus enduringly relevant requires integrating everything we've examined into coherent conclusions. The central achievement is his analysis of human agency and its limits. Epictetus identified with remarkable precision exactly what lies within human control. The operation of prohairesis itself, our capacity to evaluate impressions and choose responses based on considered judgment rather than automatic reaction. Gap. Everything else, including our bodies, other people's choices, and external events, lies partly or wholly outside our control, regardless of how much we might influence them. This distinction solves a genuine problem in human psychology. We suffer massively from trying to control what we cannot control and failing to exercise control where we actually have it. Gap. We agonize over others' opinions while neglecting to examine our own judgments. We chase external success while ignoring the development of character that remains entirely within our power. Gap. Epictetus's framework redirects effort toward what we can actually change, reducing futile struggle with the unchangeable. The cognitive architecture he describes maps onto actual brain systems in ways he couldn't have known. Automatic impression formation corresponds to subcortical emotional processing happening before conscious awareness. Gap. The capacity to examine impressions before assenting corresponds to prefrontal cognitive control systems that can modulate automatic responses. The training of prohairesis through practice corresponds to neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to strengthen neural pathways through repeated activation. Modern neuroscience reveals why Epictetus's techniques work at the physical level. Examining impressions activates lateral prefrontal cortex, which can inhibit amygdala responses through top-down regulation. Gap. Reappraising emotional situations changes both subjective experience and measurable brain activity. Repeated practice strengthens these regulatory circuits, making cognitive control more efficient and automatic over time. Gap. The philosophical practices literally reshape brain function in ways that reduce suffering and improve agency. However, neuroscience also reveals limits Epictetus didn't recognize. Severe brain damage or dysfunction can compromise prohairesis itself. The capacity for rational choice, he claimed, was invulnerable. Gap. Extreme trauma can dysregulate the nervous system in ways that resist purely cognitive intervention. Some mental illnesses involve neurochemical imbalances that philosophical training alone cannot correct. Gap. The biological substrate of prohairesis can fail, limiting the unconditional freedom Epictetus proclaimed. The value theory remains the most controversial element of his philosophy. The claim that only virtue is genuinely good, while health, relationships, and all external goods are merely indifferent conflicts with common sense and most ethical theories. Gap. It seems to deny obvious facts about what makes lives go well or badly, reducing well-being to a single dimension when it's clearly multifaceted. Yet this radical claim serves a crucial therapeutic function. If you believe that external goods are necessary for happiness, you make yourself vulnerable to devastating loss when circumstances change. Gap. The hedonic treadmill ensures that obtaining desired externals provides only temporary satisfaction before desire resets to new targets. Recognizing that externals are preferred but not necessary can break this cycle, providing a more stable basis for contentment. The question is whether you need Stoic orthodoxy that only virtue is good or can accept a more moderate position. Perhaps multiple things contribute to well-being. Virtue certainly, but also health, meaningful relationships and reasonable success in valued pursuits. Gap. Perhaps Epictetus rightly identified that we overvalue externals, but wrongly concluded they have no value at all. A pluralist theory of value might better capture reality while preserving the practical insight that overinvestment in externals creates suffering. The role ethics provides valuable resources for thinking about identity, obligation, and social connection. We are not atomic individuals pursuing self-interest, but persons constituted through relationships with identities shaped by the roles we occupy. Gap. This recognition grounds ethics in actual human life rather than abstraction, makes duties concrete rather than merely theoretical, and explains how individual flourishing inherently involves social participation. But the framework needs supplementation to avoid conservatism that justifies unjust hierarchies. Not all actual roles deserve acceptance and excellent performance. Gap. Some roles should be rejected as inconsistent with human dignity. Some hierarchies challenged as violating the equality implied by shared rational nature. Epictetus's cosmopolitanism provides resources for this critique, but he failed to apply them to slavery and gender inequality in his own context. Gap. Modern appropriations must do better using role ethics while critically examining which roles legitimate society should maintain. The conception of freedom as inner self-mastery independent of external circumstances remains profound and problematic. It's profound because it identifies a real dimension of freedom that survives even extreme external constraint. Gap. Viktor Frankl in concentration camps, prisoners under unjust regimes, and slaves in bondage all testified to inner freedom that circumstances couldn't destroy. This psychological and spiritual freedom matters tremendously and deserves the emphasis Epictetus gives it. But it's problematic because overemphasis risks devaluing political freedom and material conditions. Inner freedom doesn't make external freedom unimportant or suffering acceptable. Gap. People need both psychological capacity to maintain dignity and external conditions that respect that dignity. Stoicism contributes to the first, but must be supplemented with political philosophy addressing the second. Gap. The philosophy should inspire both inner work on character and outer work toward justice, not inner work instead of outer work. The emotion theory, with its ideal of apatheia, contains deep insights, but requires revision. Epictetus correctly identified that emotions incorporate evaluative beliefs, that these beliefs can be examined and revised, and that doing so transforms emotional experience. Gap. This cognitive model of emotion has been empirically validated and forms the basis of effective psychotherapy. The practices he prescribes for managing emotions work, reducing suffering and increasing psychological flexibility. But the goal of eliminating all passions and achieving complete emotional equanimity is probably neither achievable nor desirable for most people. Some emotional responses are appropriate to circumstances, and trying to eliminate them might do more harm than good. Gap. Grief at loss, fear of danger, and anger at injustice can be rational responses when proportionate and not based on false beliefs about where value resides. The goal should be emotional regulation, not emotional elimination, managing emotions wisely rather than transcending them entirely. The metaphysical framework grounding Epictetus's ethics in cosmic providence and rational divine order cannot survive scientific scrutiny. The universe operates according to natural laws without purpose or design. Evolution shaped humans through selection, not divine intention, and suffering exists for purely natural reasons without cosmic justification. Gap. This undercuts the systematic unity of Stoic philosophy, leaving the ethics without its original foundation. Yet the ethical insights might survive this transition better than initially appears. Even in an indifferent universe, facts about human nature and psychology make certain responses more conducive to flourishing than others. Gap. We are social beings who function better with stable, virtuous character than with unstable, vicious character. We have cognitive control capacities that, when properly developed, reduce suffering and increase agency. We flourish through meaningful relationships, valued activities, and contributions to communities. Gap. These facts ground ethics naturalistically without requiring cosmic purpose. The therapeutic model of philosophy represents Epictetus's most important legacy. Philosophy is not primarily abstract theorizing about reality, but practical training for living well, addressing actual human suffering through systematic methods for reshaping thought, emotion, minds, and behavior. B-A-R. This conception influenced early Christianity, medieval monasticism, Renaissance humanism, Enlightenment moral philosophy, and ultimately modern psychotherapy. The contemporary Renaissance of Stoicism continues this tradition, applying ancient wisdom to modern challenges using contemporary language and evidence. This therapeutic turn has critics who argue it reduces philosophy to self-help, abandoning truth seeking for mere utility. Philosophy should pursue truth wherever it leads, including truths that don't make us happier or better people. Gap. Limiting philosophy to therapeutic purposes corrupts it into ideology serving psychological comfort rather than intellectual honesty. Epictetus would reject this dichotomy. For him, understanding truth about human nature, value, and the cosmos is identical with learning to live well, because living well requires correct understanding. Gap. You cannot flourish while holding false beliefs about what matters and how to respond to circumstances. Therapy and truth-seeking are not competing aims, but complementary aspects of the same philosophical project. The enduring relevance of Epictetus comes from addressing permanent features of human psychology and the human condition. We will always face challenges we cannot fully control, experience emotions based on our interpretations of events, struggle with the gap between our ideals and our actions, and need communities that both constrain and enable us. Gap. These are not historically contingent problems that social progress will eliminate, but structural features of what it means to be human. Epictetus provides systematic methods for navigating these permanent challenges. His techniques for managing impressions, his framework for distinguishing controllable from uncontrollable, his emphasis on character development through practice, and his integration of individual and social goods remain relevant regardless of technological change or cultural evolution. Gap. The specifics of what counts as preferred indifference may vary across contexts, but the basic distinction applies universally. The content of roles changes, but role-based ethics captures something real about human identity and obligation. What cannot remain is uncritical acceptance of everything Epictetus taught. His metaphysical commitments are untenable, his value theory too extreme, his political conservatism unacceptable, and his claims about what philosophy can achieve, overstated gap modern appropriations, must be critical, preserving valuable insights while discarding elements that don't survive scrutiny. This is not betraying Epictetus, but following his own method of examining beliefs carefully rather than accepting received wisdom on authority. The strongest case for Epictetus is neither that he was perfectly right about everything, nor that his ideas work as effective self-help techniques. It's that he developed a sophisticated, systematic philosophy of human agency, addressing real problems in living with methods that generally work when properly applied. Gap. He made errors correctable through later knowledge while identifying truths that remain valid across contexts. He created a framework flexible enough to adapt to new circumstances while maintaining coherent core commitments. This combination of systematic rigor, practical effectiveness, and adaptability explains why a philosophy developed by a slave 20 centuries ago continues influencing emperors and therapists, mystics and scientists, prisoners and professors. Epictetus spoke to something permanent in human experience with unusual clarity and depth. Gap. His voice deserves hearing not as an ancient authority to obey, but as a conversation partner who saw some things about human nature with remarkable precision, and can help us see them too. The ultimate question each person must answer is whether this philosophy, suitably adapted and corrected, can contribute to their own flourishing. Does the framework help you manage thoughts and emotions more effectively? Gap. Does it provide clearer understanding of what you control and what you must accept? Does it ground meaningful values and guide difficult choices? Does it connect you to community and tradition while maintaining intellectual honesty? If yes, then Epictetus remains a living philosopher whose ideas deserve serious engagement and thoughtful application. If no, then he's a historical figure worth understanding for his influence, but not personally relevant as a guide for living. Gap. Either way, grappling seriously with his philosophy enriches understanding of what humans have thought about how to live well, what works and what doesn't, and what makes some philosophical visions enduringly powerful while others fade into obscurity. Epictetus endures because he addressed real problems with genuine insight, created practical methods that demonstrably work, and articulated a vision of human excellence that continues inspiring people despite its flaws and limitations. This is not everything a philosophy needs to be, but it's something important that philosophy can be. Wisdom for living, transmitted across centuries, tested by experience, refined by criticism, and available for those who need it.